Okay, good morning again, and welcome to this third and last session of the conference with Isolated Intelligence. I would like to introduce you Vincenzo Napolano, who is the head of communication at the Ego Virgo Center, and he will going to give a very short presentation, but it's really nice his presence here. And also I would like to thank the media event of the University of Pisa for recording this event. Of course, we will be in touch with you for asking for permission to publish the recording on our website. Thank you very much for being here. Yesterday it was a very interesting day of many really super interesting. I have to say I'm really lucky to have all of you here in Pisa. So thank you very much. And Vincenzo.
Thank you, Lina. I apologize for not being yesterday here. I did not join, but we have a very close collaboration with the department and Lina especially, and so I will also profit of the recording. So I was not supposed actually to having slide, but I recover a presentation, but I will just use it for showing you some images, and basically in few minutes tell who we are and more or less what we are doing. So EGO, European Gravitational Observatory, is one of the three observatory in the world able to capture, to detect gravitational waves. One in Europe, here, close to here, and the other two are in US, are called LIGO. So we detect this very remote signal coming from the cosmos, something that is generated by mergers of black hole, explosion of star, million or billion of light years from the Earth. There is a very complex technology, of course, and there is this activity of listening to the more flexible and remote signal coming from the cosmos. But the point here is probably another one. So we, as a large research infrastructure, are convinced, also together with my director, Professor Massimo Carpinelli, who I bring also his greetings, that so the mission of such large research infrastructure is not just to make science, of course, and exploring the cosmos, but also in a sense to value as much as possible the connection with the societies and with other disciplines at large. That's why we have this, we open a lot of projects of collaboration and dialogue, especially with artists, but also with architects, musicians, a lot of different expertise, a lot of different creativity, a lot of different intelligence, could we say. And the idea are basically to, in a sense, of course, the infrastructure is in the world, is a living body in the world, so need the connection with all the other disciplines to design the space, tell the story of what we are doing, and a lot of other things. But in another sense, we also want to, how to say, draw the new horizon that we are discovering together with the expertise of other disciplines. That's why we have this close collaboration with artists. So we are discovering that the universe is much larger and much more violent of what we have imagined. We are discovering that we are able to listen what is happening in the universe in such remote areas, so billions of light years from the Earth. We are discovering that we can listen to the universe and also, in a sense, I would say in a multi-sensory way, so that we can listen, we can watch into the universe, we can use a lot of different signals, a lot of different senses for exploring the universe. We also are aware that for listening such a remote phenomenon, we have to monitor and to listen at the same time all the things that in a sense are happening around us. So one of the points of the observatory is, for instance, that we are plenty of sensors that are monitoring the humidity, all the vibration around the site, the wind, the atmospheric phenomena. For instance, the waves of the sea on the Mediterranean coast, or the earthquake that are happening around in the earth, also in Japan or in Asia. So at the same time, we are an antenna listening to the far cosmos and an antenna listening to the environment and also to the human activity around us. So all these kind of messages we think can be the base of a very strong dialogue with artists, with architects, with a lot of different expertise. And that's, as I said, I brought this image just to show you very quickly some result of this collaboration. This is, for instance, an artwork of Thomas Saraceno, who is also an architect. He's a very famous international renowned artist, contemporary artist. He worked a lot with spider webs, and there is this metaphor of the spider webs connected to the spider web of the cosmos, so the structure, the very large-scale structure of the cosmos. This is an artwork of a young Italian artist called Lulu Nuti. The title is In My Hand Is My Beginning, and that's it's a sculpture. She did a residence of a couple of weeks at Igo. Now we are working with, this is an aerial picture of the site. So the observatory is done by, as an L shape, and is done by this L shape, and there is a laser going forth and back along the two arms, but okay, there is no time now to explain. These are other pictures of exhibition in which artists, in a sense, dialogue with science and with our science. This is an artwork of Laurent Grassot about listening the echo of the Big Bang, again Saraceno. This was an exhibition in which we mixed science object and artists. This is Lilian Lin about black hole, gravity's dance. This is another artwork of Thomas Saraceno, very large, a cosmic network made at Palais de Tokyo, in which we connected Palais de Tokyo with all the experiment live, with all the experiment that detect signals in the far cosmos, and these experiments were transformed in vibration of these wires inside the artwork. So you have a kind of resonance environment of everything is coming from the cosmos to the earth. And then there is last point, and then I will close, this horizon of sonification. So it's very easy to sonify gravitational waves. Gravitational waves are not sound, are vibration of space-time, so something very complex, but are not sound. But we can very easily transform the waveform of the gravitational wave in a sound, so we can, in a sense, have a sonic display of the wave and listen to that. And I will now let you listen the sound of two black holes that merge at 1 billion light year from Earth. And the point here is that, of course, from here you can start to make a lot of creative work. So you can imagine to make a symphony, to make electronic music, just to sonify different signals, to mix them, and so on. But I will close my very short greetings with the sound of the two black holes. Consider that the sound comes from 1 billion light years, so it's not so loud. So it's remind more a whisper than the physicists called it chirp than an explosion. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to listen to your presentation.
So thank you very much for this presentation, and good morning, and welcome to this machine session of the conference. I am Elisa, and I will moderate this session with Benedetta Marati from University of Pisa and Per John Dahl from Lund University. And now I will briefly introduce the teams that we will discuss in this session, and then we can move on the first presentation. This section explores the relationship between physical space design and artificial intelligence. The growing spread of technology and machines is radically changing both our built environment and the way we design it. In fact, on one side, architecture is now asked to host new invisible machines, such as data centers, server farms, and digital infrastructures, which form a physical backbone of the artificial intelligence. These are spaces without human presence, with a very high technical density, often located in remote areas and hidden from public view. OMA, with the exhibition Countryside, the Future, explored the spread of data centers in the American desert, placing them inside natural landscapes. MVRDV with Metacity Data Town, as we will also see in one of today's presentations, imagined a provocative scenario where the buildings of the city are nothing more than data and information. The city itself becomes the data center. So we can ask, what is the architectural face of AI, and what shape do the spaces of machines take in the digital age? On the other side, architecture itself is increasingly designed, simulated, or generated through AI-based tools and predictive models. The architect is no longer only an author, but also someone who works together with machines that can propose, choose, and repeat solutions. For instance, in 2019, Philip Stark presented the first chair designed with artificial intelligence. At the same time, 3 former OMA designers created Xcool, one of the first AI tools trained especially for architects, helping from the first master plan layouts to the final construction stage. In this scenario, the architect becomes more and more a hybrid figure, working in close connection with AI tools that expand creative and imaginative possibilities. So today, new contradictions are appearing. Architects, once a part of a human network, risk becoming isolated by interacting almost solely with machines. What new ethics emerge in generative design, and can architecture still be considered a human act of the age, in the age of artificial intelligence? So now I can call you the first speaker. Antonio Azzolini from Sapienza University of Rome with the contribution Weird and Eerie Inventors, reading 3 Machines by Cedric Price. So, okay. So welcome, Antonio.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Thank you to Professor Malfona, actually, for organizing this space of exchange. Therefore, I'm the one that have to break the ice, and it's very funny for an introvert, but I try to. And in this regard, this session is entitled Machine, of course, as Elisa said. And in this regard, my intervention today aims to propose a close reading of Cedric Price, which of course is a well-known figure, made by 3, this lecture is made by 3 of his architecture, or machine, if we want to look at them. So, of course, Cedric Price is a key figure of the late 20th century, and the need to talk about him nowadays go beyond the importance of his figure on the only label of radical architect that sometimes as historical synthesis tends to mummify to portray. And of course, reading Cedric Price, speaking about it, encountering and also studying show a complex figure that is 3-dimensional and made of different aspects that cannot be synthesized in only one word. Of course, he was a student, and the first time he started with dealing with the form. This is a very funny model that is in his collection that reminds me Moretti's models, of course. And of course, he was not also a student, but also a builder, actually, which is very strange for to imagine Cedric Price as a builder. But he was very capable of drawing, very capable of managing the paper space, but also the physical space. And of course, he was also a radical thinker, which is the most famous figure about him. But the regular thinking was capable of thinking out of the box. It was always a think of it was always a matter of placing himself in different spaces and finding other point of views. Of course, he was a teacher. He spent a lot of time, entire of his career at Architectural Association, but also he was furthermore, he was also a collector, most of them. And if you go through the archive of Cedric Price, you're going to find out a lot of a series of bizarre objects from Seeger's boxes planned as a little city, zeppelins, and very detailed, I don't know why, but pamphlet about cows with dimension and etc. Of course, those objects are very funny to find out when you have the chance to go through the archive. But actually, it's very interesting how you find those objects, because they are not objects thrown in the middle of something. They are some kind of things that are actually. They lie inside the project, like they fold inside the project. Every kind of these bizarre things had something to do with the project itself. So, in short, Cedric Price was many things, and reducing the figure in only one label is reductive. And to move away from this label, maybe we should find. Maybe I tried to find an umbrella category in this occasion that explain the authorial value of Cedric Price, which of course is prolific, strange, bizarre, provocative, but in the real sense he was an inventor actually, and it's Wise was an inventor because he always think about architecture as a machine, as something that is not about space, but it's something that allows the creation of spaces that is mutable, different, and whatever. And of course, in this point of view, you find out some ways that is like an hyperstition, some anticipation of what we're facing today about authorship, about how we can imagine spaces. Of course, I'm not talking actually about the Fan Palace, which is, of course, the most famous project about Cedric Price, but is a starting point, of course, because actually, Cedric Price was not an architect that made like in the Association of the Edge and the Fox of Archilochus. He was a kind of person that a kind of architect that find out one ideas and pursue those ideas every time, in every project. So. The Fan Palace, of course, started in 1961, never built. It was commissioned by John Littlewood, that was a theater director. But it's important that to not consider the Fan Palace as a radical, an imaginative project. It wanted to be built. Cedric Price wanted to build this building, actually. And so, of course, the important moment about the real switch about the Fan Palace is about going beyond the traditional building and to build a device, actually, a sort of motherboard that where the structure is, which is the only fixed things, can mutate itself in a special configuration based on upon users or inhabitants' wills. So there is a coincidence. The period when the Fan Palace is think is not a period, a random period. At the same time. In fact, the importance mutation that is connected with the Fan Palace for architecture is not typological or functional. It's more about a change about design hierarchy, in switching the design hierarchy. In fact, in the same years, there are Paul Baran. Those are schemes from Paul Baran, which was an engineer in Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley was what we call now, and he made the shift from a centralized network to the distributed network, so from a vertical system to a horizontal and interconnected one. So it is told about this Paul Baran as those schemes as the birth of internet, or more or less. But why is important for architecture? Because in the same year, Price was working with Banham, was working with Gordon Pask, which was a cybernetic scientist, actually. And the shift in architecture for Price is not thinking about architecture as a setup of spatial or functional planning, but thinking in a perspective of a temporal programming of the architecture. So this perspective changes whereby the machines, and of course we can imagine also architecture as machine in this context of Cedric Price, invert their function from only an utilitarian nature towards a different perspective that starts from the user and that are the reader of the machine. To do this, those years are also the time where postmodernism talks about the death of the author and what does it mean to be an author, and to and switch out the importance from the author to the reader is Roland Barthes, of course. But it happens also in architecture with the Fan Palace. So those are some coincidences that I assume, but we can read in that way. And so to let able the changing in from spatial and functional to temporally. Price is conscious that he have to die as an author, so he works in this game of presence and absence inside his architecture, and his Fan Palace is a kind of experience, and taking off from architecture as an author take place for the people to use the architecture in new ways and to interpret them. But how can we define the rules of presence and absence of authorship that is hoped by Barthes and pursued by Price? Well, a precious fitting help comes from Mark Fisher, which is the title of my essay is upon an essay of Mark Fisher of 10 years ago, that where he defined weird and eerie as different categories of the same strangeness. And he defined exactly as those categories are different only from a point of view of presence or absence. This concept is very easily it's possible very easily to translate this concept as in some kind of art examples. And so for Fisher, weird is something that is exorbitant about his presence. So there is something that should not be there and you see it. And on the other side, the eerie is the opposite condition, which is absence, of course. And you find a place or whatever, a condition where where there is the sorry, because Italian and English is merging in my mind now. But where something that should be there is not there, so is absence. And talking about machines, the machines of Cedric Price, and going directly to the point, the first one is the interaction center, which is, I assume, is as a weird category, but of course this reading in those categories is not very rigid. The Interaction Center was a community center built in, was one of the rare building constructed by Cedric Price, which was not very lucky in building his architecture. So it was built between 1973 and 1979. And actually is a scaled down model of the Fan Palace. Is a replica, is an adaptation of that ancestor. But we are going to see that the Fan Palace is always present in different ways. But this is the most similar one to the Fan Palace. So actually, of course, as a plan is very easily is formless because the only important things in the scheme that in the layout that Price gives is the structure, so the points of the pillars and that hold the beams. All the other settings is temporary, of course, and it's actually a device which is shapeless, and the multiple functional spaces are installed and superimposed upon this wireframe structure. But the importance of the fan palace and the weirdness about repeating things in other scales is actually is declared by Cedric Price because the fan palace is a unit of measure of things for himself. This is a scheme that shows up the dimension of the fan palace compared to of course, the Pompidou, which is an unautorized copy of that, with the interaction and with the generator, no? Which are some of Price's important project. So building architecture and fan palace is building a device that could be used in other situations, that could be replicated and could measure the reality. So furthermore, the weird dimension lies also in the fact that the center it doesn't not weird. I mean the strangeness to get out to the Fisher category is also to the fact that it's not a conventional architecture, but is an hardware very informal. As I say, the project is a simple grid of steel elements, is a base structure, and the aim is to not define any fixed space. The spaces that are used are modules that works in a plug and play structure. So those are prefabricated and are inserted inside the grid as the need change, and they are designed in different ways. The modules are taken from catalog, so there is no an effort to design itself. So the author, and we can see how in this way he goes through the eeriness. So he get out to the aim of designing everything that sometimes architects have. What's the image that came out is a rough and direct, honest aesthetic, where the prefabrication generates a kind of anomaly in the urban fabric, because I mean the interaction center was planned inside the Camden, which was a residential place, and so the community center served to the people of that. So it's a kind of intrusive presence, and so in this way is weird. And the Price authorial dimension is strong and clear because it's is declaring and is like building the fan palace, the little game that he could not be able to build with John Littlewood. So the strangeness is also about the management system, because and we can see in this point of view the eeriness, because Price find out and pursues fragmented and delegated role. So according to the management system, the young people of Camden Town are involved in not in the construction, but in the construction of the interior spaces and workshop, and they decide the use of the space and progressively modify them. It's funny, the end of the interaction, actually, the interaction center, because, and we can see exactly the eeriness of Price, because his complete detachment from his work reached its peak at the end of the life of this building. This building has been demolished in the early 2000s, and it was proposed by the governmental association, whatever, to be listed as a heritage building. But Price was still alive in that time, but he firstly opposed to the renovation of the preservation, sorry, of the building, and actually started a counterposed campaign to demolish him, and in fact he won to that. So the second one, the second machine, where speaking about how to disappear completely as an author, is about the generator, which is a project from the 80s. This one was not built as most of the Price project, but about the condition of absence is, and so the Renaissance, this project takes a significant meaning, because it takes on a higher level the disappearance of the architect, and so the manager of the spaces. So basically, the project was not built because it was an utopistic project. It was not built because it was commissioned by a paper company that in Florida wanted a recreational space for the employees. And so the project is very simple in what implies from the architectural point of view. The project is about a slogan that Price has had during this project was any size, only one shape. So he reduced anything to the minimum shape possible, which was for Price a cube. Which was I think 12 foot for sides. And any size or only one shape means that he replicate this model in 150 units, and those units were possible to be managed and settled in very different ways, according, of course, to his design principle of muting structure. But the cube is, and we can see also in this point the fact of Price repeating itself through the entire of his work. I mean, a set of this kind of walls, of this kind of cubed structure was also proposed. Was also a proposal for the first pilot project that was made for the Fan Palace that was actually exchanged. But this is the first image of the Fan Palace. Of course, the idea of working with a light and simple module, which is the cube, had the ambition to make the project mobile, meaning that the cubic room could be assembled not only in different way in themselves, but can be also managed inside the space, changing the disposition of that. And of course, the space, this is a kind of plan that could be imagined about it's very strange because there is no actual plan. This is one of the possible plan, because it works on a grid and those cubes are settled by a crane, a mobile crane, all the time. But what is the recondition is not only when it comes. The recondition is of course on the first level about those are the prototypes that he made. The first aspect is about on a figurative aspect. So seeing 150 wireframe boxes in the middle of nowhere in Florida, it's in a forest in Florida, is quite alienating and quite eerie itself, because you see those cubes and I mean it's a very strange special condition. But actually the true absence is the authorial absence, because in this project, and this is a kind of a prehistory of sensible architecture, of data-driven architecture, because in fact Price defines the generator as the first intelligent architecture. He involves in the project some IT consultants, which were John and Julia Fraser. And he started to find out how to move the boxes inside the grid with a computerized control system. It doesn't want to get into the system of designing the plan. So there were software programs created to, of course, imaginative. They were not realized, but the idea was to create software that proceed with the reconfiguration of the modules. There was a kind of was entitled boredom program that changed actually the configuration after an amount of time, even if the people didn't want it. So. I mean, is the kind of condition where the architecture functions without the architects. The architect only gives a toolkit to design the space. And the space is self-generated by not even the user anymore, but it's generated by a logic of desire, of course, of the user, but also by randomness. And the last one, machine, which is a kind of it's kind of conclusion of the Cedric Price work, is one of his last projects, is a kind of space that merged those both conditions. This is the bathhead. It was a proposal for changing and imaging reimaging the Battersea Power Station in London. And is of course evocative and enigmatic. This was an utopian project and very provocative, but the occasion of course is about the competition for the Battersea Power Station during the 90s, but he started to think about it from the 80s because I mean the industrialization created a little problem about this big and huge element. And the idea is very brutal and poetic at the same time. He demolished the brick mass of the power station, the lower level, maintaining only the upper level, creating a floating roof on that maintain also the chimneys. Price describes this design action in very synthetic way, saying that we have divested the existing building of all that froze the immediate site, leaving only that which is considered important. It's said and its familiar profile. I mean, this is a description. And in fact, the idea of a floating boat in London sky is supported by constructively by a steel structure that, of course, by the scale and the dimension of the Battersea Power Station is very light, but it's not light actually. But in this project, the weird and eerie converge. On one end, there is the weird given by the institutional provocation, which is demolishing a building just declared as an historical heritage site, is iconoclastic in somehow. And the author manifests his presence in a very present way, because and powerful way, because is the only one that could choose what is need to be remade about the architecture. Of course, he made like comparing, sizing the Battersea Power Station with the other. But Price goes beyond the provocation about the monument itself. He proposed that the suspended chimneys have to be devices, actually. So he wanted them to be like climate chimneys that works that actually work. Because otherwise, if the monument have not a function for Price, is useless. So it's better to demolish them. And also, on the other hand, there is the eeriness, which is created by the absence of the lower level. But the space left below, under the new roof, is not a banal void. It is an absence filled with the urban memory of the building, actually. And so the city finds itself looking a ghost that fly above that, like an howling castle, for instance. But in the paradox where erasing means simultaneously preserving and cancelling, deleting, the fact is that it creates a space for a new function, new way to imagine the city of London. So to conclude, what those Cedric Price was famous for his famous quote about technology was the answer, what was the question. So I don't have a lot of answer, but it's important from my point of view to look at those kind of example to actually make question about the architectural debate contemporary. So we today question what remains of the author when architecture could be designed by AI or the digital turn has changed in a very deep way the profession. So we can see that the isolated intelligence of Cedric Price could anticipate those questions a lot of time ago in a very prehistorical way, we can say, in a very rude way, but in a different way. But his work that demonstrate that even any kind of changes, the author never completely disappear, but is intentionally withdraws. I mean, he gets away from the scene. Authorship in this kind of way becomes a planned absence, and of course, and calculated subtraction is not something that is taken off from the architect, the control of the project. So the responsibility of the architect to the work doesn't vanish, change. I mean, this is the only thing that I think I understood by looking at Cedric Price. So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for this interesting presentation. Now the next presentation is from Physical to Data Town, Architectures, Tabular Interfaces in the Long Digital Turn by Matthijs Groskopmanis from TU Delft. So, welcome, Matthijs.
I have to hold this like this? Okay. Yeah. Okay, let me find the setup. I saw yesterday many people were sitting like that. So I want to. Okay. Notes. Okay, great. Thank you. I would like to start with this image. I assume many of you might recognize it. I hope you do. It comes from the MVRDV's project called Metacity / Data Town, which was published in the very late 1990s. In the words of one of the main protagonists or authors of the project, Winnie Maas, and I quote, "This is a city that wants to be described by information. It's a city that knows no given topography, no prescribed ideology, no representation, no context, only huge pure data," end quote. I suspect we know maybe this project less well than we assume, and that's why I want to kind of unpack it today. And I think it's also important to look at it because I think it reveals explicitly what many other digitally produced architectural projects obfuscate in a way, namely the kind of importance of non-visual information and data that ultimately shapes architecture and urban form, maybe beyond the kind of visible range of architecture. So the red bars that you see in the foreground are a very small portion of the total of 8.2 thousand square kilometers of housing, while the artificial topographies on the back are the kind of 88.6 square kilometers of waste dump produced by the urban metabolism of Data Town. At least that's what the statistical model beneath this image assumed. So actually, the entire Metacity Data Town project is generated by a number of spreadsheets. For instance, this is a printout of a spreadsheet that structured the overall city's dimensions. As you can see, it's a bit small and it's a small screen, but I'm going to try to narrate what you should be seeing. You can check the data after if it's correct or not. So the column headers organize this city into different functional sectors, such as CO2 forest, agriculture, cemetery, living area, services, dry nature, greenhouses, waste dump, and so on. Now, each of these sectors are then assigned a particular kind of numerical property that ultimately defines their dimensions and the kind of their total area within the project. As you can maybe see on the screen, even in printed form, the spreadsheet was kind of still used to decide and manipulate these dimensions. So there are many kind of markups and edits even in the kind of printed form. If you look at other spreadsheets that made this project, you can see that they kind of break down these overall sectors into kind of smaller statistical kind of makeup of them. So each row, and maybe you can see it, each row of this spreadsheet can show things such as area that is needed for waste recycling and other processes. And this whole sheet is only for the so-called waste dump sector. So you can see different kind of quantities of metric tons. You can see percentages of total area that this project might occupy, as well as the kind of empty bar somewhere that talks about future scenarios. So this spreadsheet, like many others in this project, is more than a table that kind of passively contains data. I would say it's more akin to an active mechanism that calculates and decides on project organization, form, dimensions, without drawing a single line or a single wall or a single building. So like all other materials produced by architects with computers, I would say the spreadsheets, like the ones you saw from Datatown, were generated by operation of interfaces of software. Interfaces do not merely represent things, but rather they produce particular ways of working and knowing. They don't represent technology, but rather maybe they represent the kind of relation to technology, as for example, Brendan Hookway put it. More importantly, I think when we talk about spreadsheets, not all interfaces are the same. Today, I'm particularly focusing on tabular interfaces. What makes them particular is that their kind of epistemic logic rests on the grid as an organizing device. Unlike interfaces that simulate interactions within 2- and 3-dimensional space, so you can think of computer-aided design software, text, video, or photo editors, the tabular interface functions strictly within confines of a table and a cell. So in a way, tabular interfaces abstract the world into discrete units of data, or as Bernard Sigert put it in his assessment of the grid as a cultural technique, they merge representation and operation, or the effects on the real. So I would say, I think by extent, in a way, whatever cannot be reliably converted into the grid and its values must be kind of excluded from it, and whatever enters the grid must assimilate to its form. So the first commercial software that allowed manipulating tabular interfaces was launched in 1979 for Apple II computers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was conceived by 2 Harvard Business School and MIT alumni who sought to find ways of using computers to automate laborious corporate accounting calculations in one of the graduate school classes. This software was called VisiCalc, which is shorthand for visual calculator. Unlike static paper tables that would record information in a fixed form, VisiCalc, for the first time, offered a tabular interface that would visualize real-time calculations of any kind of data, as long as it could be turned into alphanumeric form. So soon after the launch of VisiCalc, of course, there was a flood of derivative software products that showed up and kind of contested this new software space of personal and professional computing, including Microsoft Multiplan that later became Excel, as you would know today. And of course, this opened a whole new genre of like software products for organizing and calculating data through forms of tabular interfaces. Stuart Brand, in his 1984 Whole Earth Software Catalog, noted, and I quote, "Spreadsheet programs have given me this particular vision of civilization. You can have a vast array of meaningful numbers, and all the numbers know about each other. Change any one of them, and they all adjust immediately. They're positively ecological in that sense," end of quote. So in a way, there was this kind of like awareness emerging with this kind of software that you can kind of use data to model complex, maybe linear, but still like complex relationships between different kind of forms of data. And of course, architecture was no exception to the kind of like excitement about spreadsheets. It might not sound believable today, but it certainly was the case in the early 80s. So what VisiCalc, in a way, oh wait, sorry, did I miss a slide? Oh yeah, sorry, this is more important. Before we talk about architecture, I think it's important to note that I think VisiCalc, as a software product and as a logic of an interface, in a way, introduced not digital tabulation as such. Tables and ledgers have organized information for millennia, ranging from early money accounting, double entry bookkeeping, as we might know very well in this geo zone of Europe, but also building specifications that supposedly preceded architectural drawing as a medium for recording building information. So the actual difference that VisiCalc brought, I think, was the possibility of kind of instant recalculation. So if you change one value of this data set, the whole thing will recalculate. And this was reflected very much by VisiCalc's market positioning at the time, that emphasized its capacity to run instant, quote-unquote, what-if scenarios, right? So in other words, the spreadsheet model, as it was called then and as it's called today, was in a way meant for both producing facts, but also for producing speculations. So it's not just a technology of truth, but it's also something that you kind of try things out in. And that was the kind of original intention of that. So coming to architecture, it was certainly like a thing that could be used by architects, not least because of comparably lower entry cost compared to computer-aided like drawing systems that required expensive hardware. Spreadsheet you could buy for, how much was it? £85 in 1983 value. I don't know how much that is today, but it's comparably affordable to other kind of forms of early computing at the time. So in 1983, when Autodesk just had launched the very first version of AutoCAD, the tabular interfaces of the spreadsheet were already kind of used in costing, zoning, planning, and just generally enumerating things in different architectural projects. So I think for architects, and you can see this in many periodicals at the time, in a way, spreadsheets kind of represented this medium that was both for what is, but also what if. This mode of operation, modeling without visual information through numbers, lists, and parametrically defined formulas, in a way allowed a broad set of different applications, and in a way it paved way for other perhaps more visual forms of digitalization of the practice at the time. So coming back to Metacity Datatown, the tabular interface in this project, in a way, served for both purposes. It was a speculative medium, but it also was a factual medium. And that is mainly because this project actually was based on Dutch annual statistics ranging from 1992 to 95. So in other words, MVIDV kind of like used the actual statistical makeup of the Netherlands as a starting point for the project. So it was not purely abstract in the kind of like general sense. So MVIDV then developed these kind of numeric and not architectural but numeric spreadsheet models that multiplied and extrapolated the statistical data into a kind of exaggerated what-if scenario where the population of the country would reach 241 million inhabitants. That will be then distributed in a square of 400 by 400 kilometers. So in a way, this project was much closer to a form of a digital twin of a Dutch megacity that would be conceived through this kind of tabular interface. its appearance of these kind of like red and green vertical stacks, as you can see on the slide, and all these topographies in a way where all spatial placeholders for a statistical model of the Netherlands, but also in a way it was a form of a theoretically possible city. So for instance, on the right side, you can see the green blocks are not just abstract data, but actually it is a spatial model of a vertical forest in a way. So if you zoom in into those kind of boxes, you actually see some kind of inhabitable form. So it's not just abstraction in some respect, at least the way that they intended the project to be. I think, interestingly, if you look at some unpublished manuscript pages of the Datascapes book that occupied the office throughout the kind of second part of 1990s, it seems like at least that some pages suggest that actually it was first called megacity and not metacity. And I did not make this mark on this page. It was literally already there, and you can find it in many other documents. And I think it kind of alludes to the kind of overall interest of the rapid urbanization debate of 2000s that MVRDV was kind of actively taking part. But I think also this name of the project ultimately kind of underscores some kind of duality or the kind of role of the interface that it plays between mediating between different kind of virtual operations and material realities. So metacity / data town, in a way, the name represents two systems that are separated by an interface or some kind of like mysterious zone of interaction. So in this case, I think the interface between the sprawling built environment of the Dutch state and the kind of statistical data that kind of tries to capture that process. So contrary to maybe reading this project as kind of fully digital speculation along the lines of cyberspace excitement of the 1990s, my take would be that Metacity Datatown kind of actually engaged with the question of interfacing between things and systems, and the kind of architecture's deployment of increasingly complex digital representations that try to mirror and predict the dynamics of the real-world processes, most of which rely on operations with data in alphanumeric form. So that way, Metacity Datatown renders the condition visible by not obfuscating the output of these tabular kind of operations with a refined form, but just tries to show the data itself somehow. And I think if we even try to gradually zoom out from Metacity and still look at one last digital file, digital design in general seems to, in architectural sense at least, seems to be deeply embedded in tabular interfaces that go beyond spreadsheets. So every piece of contemporary design software, and I'm not talking about language models because I think the dust hasn't settled yet, so we can talk about it in maybe 3 years with greater clarity. But in general, every piece of contemporary architectural design software relies on some form of tabular interfaces to enumerate, parametricize, and control design workflows. So if you look at this screenshot of a mid-1990s vintage 3D model of Datatown's housing sector that I opened in Rhino recently, you can see that at least two portions of the screen are occupied by kind of alphanumeric kind of interfaces. The above there's the command line that is needed for me communicating commands and kind of like dimensions and sizes of things. And then on the right side, you can see this kind of like a miniature table that is used to control all kinds of settings and parameters of what actually happens in the three-dimensional space. And both of these are absolutely crucial to any kind of design operation with the software. So when I work with it as an architect, I have to think through numbers and kind of cells to be able to communicate many things about the project. And I think this is like a minor side note, but I think it's important when we talk about spreadsheets, is that I think this maybe alludes to some kind of need for reappraisal of what parametricism meant in architecture, right? In the kind of, as it was practiced in 2000s, 2010s, maybe it kind of emphasizes kind of continuous flowing geometries, that would be this natural outcome of parametric logic of computers. But if you look at Metacity Datatown, but also the more general operation of tabular interfaces, you can kind of see that it also operates seemingly through parametric dependencies that are structured in these data formats, yet they produce a very kind of rigid, orthogonal, and mechanistic outcome. So in other words, the parametric logic does not prescribe the form as such, or as Benjamin Bratton once put it more succinctly, and I quote, a disinterested artificial intelligence would observe that the most efficacious parametric space design software of our time is Microsoft Excel. So whenever we operate digitally, typing in coordinates, setting parameters, entering values, we work with tabular logics that maybe precede and maybe also outlast any kind of formal and spatial expression. So the tabular interface kind of reorganizes the kind of maybe the epistemic relationship between data and form in architecture. If you look at the wall in BIM model, which you can see on the screen, it is not a drawn line or a modeled surface, but it's more like a bundle of different kind of parametric data that is organized in tabular form that happens to have visual representation attached to it in a way, but the data set definitely precedes the geometry that we can kind of see and work with as architects. So in a way, a BIM model is of course not a spreadsheet, but in a way it shares the functional logic with the spreadsheet. Both visually, the user interface, as you can see, but also functionally, right? This kind of idea of discretization of reality into numeric units that are then recorded into this interactive ecological data sets. To conclude, what if the notions of digital drawing, digital model, or in fact any other kind of architectural media object with a prefix of digital are mere temporary moments? Can I talk still? Do we need to evacuate? No, okay. Anyway, I'm almost done, so I think we're good. What I wanted to ask is that what if the notions of digital drawing, digital model, or any other kind of like objects that we kind of call digital are maybe just temporary moments in a much longer digital kind of like shift towards a condition where all building information will be structured on demand, and it will be done largely through tabular interfaces, parametric relationships, and generic data sets. If VisiCalc and its derivatives brought tabular interfaces to the mass market, then architectural projects like DataTown testify to the central role of those interfaces in restructuring building knowledge into these kind of discrete computable units, where maybe architectural models and statistical models converge. So that was my talk called From VisiCalc to DataTown. Thank you.
Thank you, Matis. So we can move to the next presentation by Monica Manicone from Sapienza University of Rome, with the contribution between human and machine, the lesson from Civiltà delle Macchine, reflection on the contemporary relevance of Leonardo Sinisgalli's thought. So,
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Lina and all the organizer of this conference for making this meeting and the discussion possible. I would like to begin with a reflection on the interaction between artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and creativity. The rapid integration of these tools into our daily life forces us to address not only technical issues, but also cultural and ethical ones. In architecture, this is particularly evident because artificial intelligence not only changes the tool we use, it's starting to change the way design itself is conceived. As digital systems became increasingly capable of processing data and generating solutions, this inevitably leads to a broader issue. What happens when these systems no longer simply assist the designer, but actively participate in decision-making and design process? In this context, I believe it's essential to reconsider art and critical thinking as tools capable of guiding technology. The issue concerns less what machines can do than how they relate to the cultural and social values expressed by architecture through space and form. The problem, therefore, concerns not only technological innovation, but also the cultural responsibility of architecture. Building on this reflection, I would like to return to the thought of Leonardo Sinisgalli, which can still offer a useful framework for interpretation. Living in a period so far from digital technologies, through nonetheless marked by intense industrial development, Sinisgalli imagined a non-conflictual relationship between humans and machines. Technology not as replacement, but as an extension of human abilities. Within the journal Civiltà delle Macchine, which he directed from 1953 until the second issue of 1958, he promoted an integrated vision of knowledge in which science, technology, and artistic imagination are not separate fields but reinforce each other. I believe this perspective is particularly relevant today and can help us understand the contemporary condition as a hybrid one, where design emerges from the interaction between human sensitivity and generative systems. From this perspective, Sinisgalli's contribution is important. Even when dealing with the world of machines and the industry, he never separated the technical dimension from the artistic one. On the contrary, he gave art a key role in interpreting and guiding the interaction between humans and technology. For this reason, his legacy is not only historical, but also highly relevant today. It's from this integration that we can understand current transformation, placing at the center not the machine itself, but a quality of human experience it has to produce. Sorry. Before turning to the journal itself, I would like to briefly focus on the figure of Leonardo Sinisgalli, as his biographical and intellectual trajectory offers a clear example of the relationship between scientific knowledge and artistic imagination. Sinisgalli was born in 1908 in Montemurro in Basilicata in the south of Italy and is now primarily remembered as a poet. However, his training was that of an engineer and mathematician. This dual background never resulted in a division between different fields, but rather the starting point for a unified understanding of knowledge. Throughout his career, he operated within a broad cultural network, engaging directly with some of the key figures of 20th century Italian culture. This includes both the literary world, with figures such as Ungaretti and Quasimodo, and the fields of visual art and design, with artists such as Lucio Fontana and Mario Maffei, as well as architects such as Gio Ponti, Edoardo Persico, Giuseppe Terragni, and Bernard Rudowski. These were not simply social contacts, but exchanges of ideas, influences, and in some cases collaborations, which have shaped the cultural climate of the time. Alongside his poetic work, Sinisgalli also played an active role within major industrial and communication contexts, such as Olivetti, Pirelli, and Finmeccanica. In these settings, he did not simply take on technical roles, but helped to redefine the language of industrial modernity, introducing a cultural and reflective dimension into corporate communication. It is within this framework that Civiltà delle Macchine, the Finmeccanica's journal, should be understood. Promoted by Giuseppe Eugenio Luraghi, the journal emerged as an important cultural laboratory where science, technology, art, and literature intersected to interpret the transformation of industrial modernity. Overall, Sinisgalli's figure can be read as a continuous attempt to bring scientific and artistic knowledge back into a single vision, and an ideal continuity with a Renaissance tradition, but one that is deeply reworked within the context of 20th century industrial society. In the 1950s, Italy underwent a profound phase of transformation in which its identity progressively changed as a result of the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial system. At the same time, however, cultural life was still strongly shaped by the humanist tradition, while technical and scientific knowledge struggled to gain for recognition in intellectual debate. The journal was founded by Sinisgalli and Luraghi and was launched in 1953, the same year that marked the 500th anniversary of the birth of Leonardo da Vinci. This is not a minor detail. The first cover, based on drawings by Leonardo, immediately signals the intention to recall a figure capable of uniting art, science, and technology. The aim of the project was to overcome the separation between humanist culture and technical scientific culture and to build a polytechnic vision of knowledge. Sinisgalli envisioned a dialogue between distant cultural worlds, one that brought writers and artists closer to machines while opening technical culture to intellectuals. In this framework, the machine is no longer only a symbol of industrial progress, but also becomes an object of cultural and aesthetic reflection. Sinisgalli acted as the careful and rigorous guide of the project, coordinating every phase of the editorial work. Selecting contributors to defining titles and creating the visual materials. A particularly important element of the journal is the letter that opens the early issues, a format which functions as a guiding thread for interpreting the entire project. Giuseppe Ungaretti, a close friend of Sinisgalli, who raises a question that becomes central to the entire experience of the journal, wrote the first letter, and he wrote, "How can humans avoid being dehumanized by machines while still using them as tools for progress?" From this point, a substantial and highly significant corpus of text unfolds. The journal is structured in a clear way, with sections of articles and notes and several recurring rubrics such as semaforo, biblioteca, calendario, letture, l'utile e il futile, which function as spaces for cultural experimentation. The projects involve leading writers, artists, and intellectuals with a strongly interdisciplinary approach that covers technology, economics, architecture, science, and arts. One of the most interesting aspects is precisely this dialogue between artistic culture and industrial transformation. Writers and artists are engaged with questions related to production, labor, and processes of modernization in the country. A recurring group of authors, including Sinisgalli himself, a young Paolo Portoghesi, Gilo Dorfles, Giulio Carlo Arganna, Achille Perilli, is joined by other intellectuals and scientists, creating a balance between dissemination, criticism, and narrative. Another key feature is the wide range of topics covered. Over the years, the issue directed by Sinisgalli reached 32 and include contributions ranging from industrial technology to applied science, from physics to architecture and design, from art to literature, and up to early reflection on automation and cybernetics. Over time, the journal evolves from an initial interpretative and humanist phase. It increasingly opened up to the major technological themes of the second half of the 20th century, entering into dialogue with international industrial and scientific culture. Overall, Civiltà delle Macchine moves beyond the format of a company journal, becoming a cultural laboratory where dissemination, research, and experimentation come together, and where a new form of dialogue across separate fields of knowledge is created. One of the most significant aspects of Civiltà delle Macchine is the practice of site visits to factories, workshops, construction sites, and industrial plants, through which spaces of production are reinterpreted through both technical and poetic perspective. These are not simply reports, but a powerful interpretative device. Poets, artists, and intellectuals are invited to enter industrial spaces directly, from shipyards to steelwork, from electronic laboratories to motorway construction sites, and to offer literary and visual interpretation, like the one we are seeing here, combining observation, imagination, and symbolic meaning. In continuity with Sinisgalli's vision, these texts and images do not simply describe Italian industry in the 50s, but transform it into cultural material, making it an object of critical interpretation. Industrial spaces are not merely places of work, but are transformed into settings of modernity that were still in the process of being understood. Seen from this perspective, the site visit is not only an editorial practice, but a concrete form of design, a way in which technical reality is both observed and culturally reshaped. This is also what makes the journal different from traditional company publication, because it's not celebratory or purely communicative, but constructs a distinct aesthetic of industry. The narratives of this visit, combining observation and imagination, anticipate a critical way of looking that is still relevant today when we think about contemporary technology, a gaze that does not only use tools but question and interprets them. Already in the early issue, this is clear. In 1953, for example, Giorgio Caproni, together with Renzo Vespignani, visit the Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa and produces an unexpected image, a space of varying iron, almost abstract, where industry becomes a poetic vision. The shipyard appears as a vast and unreal structure reaching toward the sky, and machines are read not only as functional tools, but as elements of language capable of producing form and meaning. Similarly, in the visit to the Saint Eustachio foundry in Brescia, Domenico Cantatore with Salvatore Quasimodo interprets the industrial environment through organic analogies. The factory is seen as an organism, and in some moments it even takes on the form of a cathedral. This shift in perception is also visible in other contributions, such as Franco Gentilini, who in the steelworks of Cornigliano recognizes a kind of cathedral of the future. Issue after issue, the artist's narratives, testimonies, and illustration unfolds, slowly composing a genuine visual geography of modern industrial society. The stabilimenti meccanici of Pozzuoli, depicted by Mario Maffei, the steelworks of Cornigliano, interpreted first by Franco Gentilini and later by Eugenio Carmi, the Termomeccanica plant in La Spezia, observed by Giulio Turcato, the Arsenale Trestino, interpreted by Marcello D'Olivo, and the airfare workshop seen through the eyes of Toti Scialoia, this one. Overall, these site visits are not simply description of production, but a practice that links direct experience with interpretation, restoring a cultural and imaginative dimension to technology. Starting from this historical experience, we can attempt to bring some of this questioning into the present. If in the 90s and 50s the challenge was to give form and visibility to the new industrial reality, today a similar tension emerges in relation to digital technologies that are increasingly pervasive and difficult to interpret. In this sense, Sinisgalli gains a relevance that goes beyond its original context, not merely as the expression of a historical moment, but as a critical lens through which to consider the contemporary relationship between architecture, technology, and design imagination. Visit to industrial plants and engagement with production processes suggests the need to renew artistic languages in order to confront a new and unsettling reality. Today, in a different yet not entirely distant way, digital systems and artificial intelligence place us before an equally profound transformation, one that requires new interpretative tools. The machine no longer appears simply as an operational instrument, but as a presence capable of reshaping the methods, timing, and logic of the design workflow. In this sense, I'm going to the conclusion. Architectural design has, for many years now, been shaped through a constant interaction between human intelligence and technological infrastructures. The central question is not which part of the process the machine may replace, but instead what it can reveal within the design process itself, opening up the new possibilities for exploration and interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And now the next speaker is Maria Rusa from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology with a presentation called Architectures, a Global Experiment. So, welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Maria, and I will talk about the global experiment in coding architecture. And I think there are quite a few conversations that are happening with the previous papers, so would be very happy to discuss. So, in a 1988 article published in Building Research and Practice, a journal of an international council for building research, addressed a topic more than familiar today: artificial intelligence in construction. The publication, however, steered quite clear of the flashy futuristic images associated with AI application today. Instead, its author, Bjørn Bindslev, a Danish architect by training and a self-described natural philosopher by inclination, was preoccupied with how structures of global language processing could both impact and could be applied to architectural and building practice. So, in the article, Bindslev was particularly concerned with the pioneering human brain model developed by the Soviet neuropsychologist Alexander Luria, and how this model could be applied to architecture. According to Luria, brain information processing consisted of three main blocks. One, a system for tonus and arousal. Two, a system for collecting, analyzing, and storing information. and 3, a system of programming, control, and regulation of mental activity. According to Binslev, the same 3 blocks corresponded directly to the information processing blocks of the architectural classification system that Binslev proposed. It was called CBC, or classification by computer. In Binslev's system, this correspondence not only made his proposed classification system natural, but also substantiated his claims to absolute universality, assuring its intuitive translation into a computer-readable code. And while Binslev's argument was part of his broader metaphysical position on architecture, this contribution, this article and the proposed building classification system by Binslev resulted actually from more than 3 decades of intra-European efforts to develop a universal language for describing architecture. So a new system of building information classification in post-war Europe was envisioned as a universalizing grammatical meta-theory, which both deconstructed and joined building information and construction processes into a universal code readable by a computer. These ambitious plans were driven not only by the rise of cybernetic system thinking in a range of social sciences, but also by an economic rationale. Developed in parallel to the project of the European Economic Union, the system was to unify the European post-war architectural production, overcoming regional cultural differences, and streamlining design and construction for large international projects. So within the context of this symposium, this paper is particularly concerned with the ambition of this mechanized universal governmentality embedded in the intra-European system of architectural classification, as well as the inevitable cultural frictions that emerge from coding architecture into a machine-readable form. As part of a broader project on the application of computer language in architecture, this contribution will then first explore the intellectual context which framed the rise of this European systems thinking in architecture, and second, zoom in on a particular Danish variation of the system tested in a large World Bank education project in Zambia, exposing embedded cultural assumptions and inevitable frictions at the application of this universalizing technology. So, to start. In the introduction to a second modernism, architectural historian Arindam Dutta discusses the techno-social turn of post-war architecture. According to Dutta, as war-born expertise infiltrated various areas of life, new means of quantification precipitated in architectural practice, aiming to curb the arbitrariness of quote-unquote aesthetic formalism. These developments coincided with the expanding role of the state, which in the post-war decades made large investments in social and physical infrastructure, and these investments had to be substantiated by large-scale data models. As Dutta maintains, post-war governmentality relied on assembling, collating, and processing larger and larger amounts of data presented through organized systems and charts. And while there have been various national attempts to organize data and information for architecture in different countries, there was little international cooperation to produce a consistent system of architectural knowledge organization. In the post-war period, as many European countries faced similar reconstruction tasks, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, or ECE, promoted the idea of intra-European cooperation in construction. The Committee on Housing, Building and Planning was established in 1947 under the auspices of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and focused on sourcing information and expertise from different member governments. The primary aim of the organization was to apply existing knowledge at the disposal of those engaged in building and housing to ensure its early and effective utilization for better building at a less cost. So in 1953, after several iterations, this initiative transformed into a separate organization, the International Council for Building Research, Studies and Documentation, called CIB. The necessary to both strengthen and promote international cooperation and the exchange of ideas, and to render reconstruction and new construction throughout Europe as efficient and as rational as possible. So the Council was to collect and distribute information on the most recent cutting-edge research in architecture, previously available only in local European languages, and share this building knowledge internationally. To do so, however, a unified system of building information recording shared across languages was necessary. So CIB was driven not only by the technocratic positivism, but also by the renewed post-war international vigor. The Council had 11 founding members, comprising institutions from Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, the United Kingdom, and Sweden. In just a couple of years, however, this organization also went global, bringing together the efforts of more than 35 affiliated organizations from Australia, Brazil, China, Ghana, India, Israel, Japan, Mexico, Pakistan, the Philippines, and the United States. So developing a new international system for classifying architectural information was not easy. As a first step, the dedicated documentation section of this council proposed implementing the Universal Decimal Classification System, UDC, perhaps familiar to many, which was a European adaptation of the Dewey Decimal Classification System, first developed in the US at the turn of the century. Essentially, this was a universal library cataloging system that classified all knowledge into 10 main groups, numbered 0 to 9, and then each further subdivided by adding new figures. However, despite being a universal system, this UDC was not entirely suitable for describing concrete building processes. And here you can see on the bottom which was deemed fitted for the UDC and which wasn't. So the CIB documentation section, headed by the Swedish architect Lars Magnus Geertz, then set out to study and evaluate more than 55 existing different building classification systems. Eventually, the CIB researchers determined that the classification system devised by the Swedish committee, called SFB, during the interwar period was best suited for expanding the existing UDC classes. The main idea was that this universal building classification system would be used to unify all notation of all building information, different components and construction processes across European construction projects, both unifying the market and communication about the projects. So the original Swedish SFB system was a faceted system that divided all architectural objects and processes into materials and works. Each facet consisted then of 25 subgroups indicated by a capital letter. However, this system incorporated the Swedish object-oriented tradition of the building industry and had to be revised for more universal use. The new CIB version of the SFB, termed UDC SFB, and that the system I will be referring to from now on, expanded it to 4 different facets. So Table 0 covered the major typologies of the built environment in general. Table 1 addressed different parts of building elements. Tables 2 and 3 presented different construction forms, while Table 4 presented abstract concepts. The logic of the construction process, as described by this UDC SFB, was based on the input of resources, materials, labor, and activity, resulting in an output of finished construction work. Coded elements could then be cross-referenced across all drawings and building documents, unifying communication across all building actors. So this UDC SFB extension, accepted by the SAB, the council that I mentioned earlier, was expected to be implemented across all SAB members, serving as a shared inter-European architectural information database and a new networked library for all things architecture. As SAB expanded internationally in the 1960s, the system was applied in different CIB member states, and rigid rules and guidebooks were published to ensure its universal application. The search for universal building classification system, however, effectively treated buildings as comparable informational objects abstracted from their situated material, labor, and cultural conditions. Nevertheless, the system implicitly embedded Northern European biases of construction culture, selling them as supposedly universal, and this universality inevitably caused frictions and weird deviations when applied to other construction and work cultures. This weirdness became even more pronounced as this rigidly coded vocabulary was applied to large building projects in the Global South. So in the following part, I will zoom into one of the genealogical lines of the system adaptation to highlight its limitations. So in Denmark, one of the main CIB protagonists that I mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, architect Bjørn Bindslev, adapted this UDC SFB into a new system called CBC, which stood for Coordination by Computer, that he developed into a full architectural consultancy. The CBC system, unlike its CIB predecessor, was adapted to the automatic recovery of the bills of quantities, so for accounting of architectural projects, and was particularly tailored to processing project documentation by computer. So different from the Swedish object-oriented tradition, Binslev was particularly interested in the work processes behind architecture and the workers' agency, which he thought was obscured in its European rendition. So the SBC aimed to capture the entirety of the construction process, proposing a model in which matter, energy, and information were inputs transformed through physical actions. The flexibility of the CBC code allowed for the identification of all relevant data for a single entity, whether labor or object related, from the start of the planning process to the delivery of the ready-made project. If the UDC SFB system, the European version, offered neutral governmentality of muted object, this Danish particular variation, the CBC system, reflected a specific ideological orientation towards work, derived from the Danish labor tradition. So the CBC system could be used manually. Sorry, this is some of the slides. So the CBC system could be used manually, but it was also originally intended for computer processing. Technically, it relied on a centralized, itemized catalog in tabulated form, coded on a magnetic tape. All project data was then stored in the centralized catalog, which was maintained throughout the project, but individual quantities and costs could be recovered at any stage. To promote the system's application, Binslev actually actively participated in the SIB European work and specifically widely promoted the service of his consultancy, CBC, specifically in Scandinavia. In the mid-1960s, for example, Binslev toured Norway and lectured at the Norwegian Union of Engineers in Oslo. The idea was to implement the system across Europe and to establish centralized documentation and data processing facilities that would be shared across the continent. Soon, however, an unexpected opportunity to test this large-scale system application presented itself in a different context, and this is how the computer processing looked back then. So in 1969, the World Bank initiated Zambia's first, this is just some of the engineers. So in 1969, the World Bank initiated Zambia's first education project, which aimed to construct and extend 65 new secondary schools within 4 years. As the project was partially funded by the Norwegian Agency for International Development, NORAD, a Norwegian engineering consultancy, Norconsult, was hired to carry out all architectural design and engineering work. To meet the project's strict deadline, Norconsult proposed standardizing construction through single-room units. These units, built with prefabricated components, could then be rearranged according to different site conditions, isolation requirements, and air circulation. So to coordinate this process of producing and assembling these different interchangeable components and room units, Norconsult proposed implementing the CBC system. CBC was expected to provide an integrated management system to coordinate the numerous prefabricated components, simplify the tedious preparation of tenders, specifications, and bills of quantities for more than 60 simultaneous building sites across the country. Following the CBC matrix, each item within the project was to be split in two parts, supply of material and labor. CBC was used for introducing progress schedules, controlling costs, printing invoices, and assisting in the preparation of final accounts. For the bureaucrats of the World Bank, the system, this is actually how one of the sheets would look like. I mean, this is a different matrix in which different variables would be inserted into. So for the bureaucrats of the World Bank, the system was a promising tool for totalizing control over all accounts and expenses, a magic wand for managing the massive accounting data of a development institution most concerned with closing its financial ledgers. So through contracts with the Zambian government, Norconsult intended to use these computer facilities of the data center in Lusaka. An unnamed Danish senior quantity surveyor, quote unquote, with experience with the use of the CBC programs as related in the archives, a description which undoubtedly referred to Binslev, was to visit Lusaka for 3 weeks in May 1970. During his stay, this quantity surveyor was expected to establish a close working relationship with the staff at the data center and train them in the essentials of the system. He was then returned to Lusaka in October for another 10 weeks to develop the structure of the master catalog and prepare specifications and bills of quantities for all project parts. All specification items were to be entered into permanently stored on a magnetic tape, which could later be reused for other building projects. Tapes for each school project were then to be produced on computers in Oslo, recoded in Copenhagen, and then sent via airmail to Lusaka. It was then be possible to automatically produce complete documents from the project tapes, eliminating the repetitive accounting work required for different sourcing combinations across all schools. Copies of the recordings were to be held in Oslo and Lusaka. Later, the CBC engineers would also collaborate with the data center staff to implement the system across other projects. These visions of Nordic cybernetic modernity, however, provided challenging to implement in practice. The idiosyncratic CBC logic, which separated elements, construction activities, and materials, and measured projects in terms of areas and volumes, was new not only to Zambian building specialists, but also to Norwegian engineers, and was heavily criticized for its obscurity. Zambian contractors were accustomed to working from drawings rather than relying heavily on specifications and bills of quantities. The CBC system, however, established a preference for the bills of quantities over drawings, and these computer-generated documents were nearly illegible for untrained specialists. This resulted in omissions, lower estimates, and incorrect costs. Entrepreneurs often signed documents without fully understanding their contents, which led to numerous delays, disputes, and additional costs. Drawings were often misinterpreted on site, resulting in construction mistakes and last-minute alterations. Lists of computerized specifications were quote-unquote too sophisticated to be easily understood by the men on a building site. The client, the Zambian Ministry of Works, this is just an illustration of the obscurity of the process. The client, the Zambian Ministry of Works, had a limited understanding of the system and relied on Norconsult's expertise. However, even Norconsult engineers had limited experience, relying entirely on the fly-in knowledge of the Danish experts. On-site alterations had to be recoded on additional tapes and then manually reintegrated into the system, defying the principle of a centralized catalog. In practice, this led to a bizarre situation in which the work carried out was quite simple, but its administration required highly qualified staff who were not always available. In the end, it seemed that only Norconsult consultants used the system, while the other actors preferred familiar systems. Overall, no contractors in the long term could take advantage of the system, even 5 years after its implementation. So one of the main benefits of the CBC system was that at any point during planning or implementation, it would be possible to recover measured quantities. However, these quantities proved irrelevant given the turbulent conditions of the 1970s Zambian economy. When the border with Rhodesia closed on January 9, 1973, and imports from South Africa were banned, the project supply chains were dramatically disrupted. Materials, tools, and equipment were stranded halfway in storage or mid-air, while material prices increased threefold and copper prices plummeted overnight. No computer-based cybernetic modernity could sort out the construction process, which was locked in political instability. The CBC system caused such an outcry that in 1978, the Zambian state launched an investigation into the project's accounting books. The project's director, British architect Norman Taylor, and financial controller Herland were questioned by the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee. As Taylor recalled, the intimidating paraphernalia of subdued lights, microphones, and tape recordings was reminiscent of interrogation chambers. And while the architects were cleared of the charges, all computer-produced documents had to be transformed into their conventional form. According to Taylor, the CBC, quote, made little short of a complete mess of the documentation of the building system and has come to stand by confusion by computer, which according to Taylor should be avoided like the plague. So what are the takeaways of this grand algorithmic project of coding architecture? Binsliv's architectural classification system offered a promise of cybernetic control, particularly appealing to technocratic administrators of large developmental projects, who were little concerned with the system's cultural implications and shortcomings. It was yet another of the weird hallucinations or dreams of control of late modernism, implemented in lieu of the former matrix of colonial power relations. The techno-modernist optimism of the system fitted well into the architectural production system developed in the global north, supported by equal parts enthusiastic participation of architects and Euro bureaucrats. However, in practice, the system was far less universal. Despite the seemingly shared cultural continuity of Northern Europe, the application of the CBC was widely debated in Norway and outright rejected for its obscurity and unsuitability to Norwegian construction culture. Still, Norwegian engineers chose to apply it in Zambia, continuing the long lineage of Western experts who treated countries in the global south as testing grounds and laboratories for technological and political innovations. The complex metaphysical accounting implications of the CBC system, rooted in the Danish labor tradition, superimposed over the Swedish object-oriented specifications, expanded for the demands of the post-war Northern European industrial market, proved entirely unsuitable for the shifting realities of Zambian planning, defined by political risks, market fluctuations, and social uncertainties. And while Norman Taylor, one of the architects behind the projects, in a final report of the Zambia World Bank Education Project, vindictively proclaimed that the CBC went bankrupt, it was really not entirely true. Despite this experience, NORAD, the Norwegian agency, maintained that the system could be applied in other developmental projects, and CBC is mentioned in the details of an architectural job posting in the Kenyan Ministry of Works as late as 1974. Binslev's company continued its operations in Norway, where the system, one of the documents, where the system was used to plan the new television broadcasting building in Oslo and a structuralist low-rise, high-density housing project, Risvalan Blackie, and a series of national highway structures and even Norwegian oil drilling platforms. In Denmark, the CBC system was applied in the planning of the Herlev Hospital in Copenhagen and several other buildings. Overall, the CBC cybernetic accounting model fitted well with the growing model of action-oriented network planning, reflecting the particular Scandinavian approach to consensus building. So to conclude, devising a new language, according to Borges, is akin to designing a new system of the universe of finding divine meaning. For Binslev, his CBC system promised a natural architectural processing model that could be universally shared, constituting the core divine promise of ultimate post-war architectural rationality. However, as the experience in Zambia showed, the deep cultural specificity of the seemingly objective classification decisions made it nearly impossible to transpose to other contexts. The CBC then, much like the other post-war classification systems, was a tool of global governmentality, attractive to global bureaucrats and Western material producers, particularly suitable for which seemed particularly suitable for large urbanization projects in the global south. It emerged in a particular historical context, optimistic about technology and global governance, fueled by a naive belief in the increasingly flattened economic and cultural space both across Europe and beyond. Ultimately, the system was the last outpost of high architectural modernism, imposing governmentality not through the finite architectural form, but through the governance of ontological construction processes. This information system was also a recursive tool that, in the aspiration to tame complexity, generated it. However, many of the ontological assumptions within this weird intra-European project of coding architecture through text have provided the foundation for later object-focused architectural programming tools, including contemporary building information modeling, or BIM. Moreover, today, in the context of the growing use of artificial intelligence and text-to-image generation, this post-war project of coding architecture for computers, which exposed the liminality of its universality, is providing increasingly more relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. So now we have the last presentation by Uri Wegman from Université Libre de Bruxelles with blind machines of divination on the mimesis of the representable at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory. So, welcome, Uri.
Thank you very much. That was such a great set of presentations. So it sucks to be last because it's hard. These are hard acts to follow. But I hope I will rise up to the occasion. So thanks again. Okay. Eyewitnesses of the Trinity test often struggle to find the words to describe what unfolded before their eyes. The oral accounts of the first nuclear explosion are peppered with words not usually associated with scientific observation. While the word weird does not appear in the accounts, expressions like awe, awesome, terrifying, grandeur, breathtaking are frequently used, attesting to the cognitive shock beset upon the viewers. As noted by Alessandro Ponte and others, the experience of the first nuclear explosion has challenged the very notion of the representable. Yet the difficulty in fully capturing the intensity and complexity of the explosion challenged not only the perception of human observers. A curious chart from a 1946 Los Alamos report presents a summary of space-time optical data of the Trinity test. Using graphs charted along time and distances axis, it describes the spatiotemporal evolution of the explosion by breaking it down into discrete visual elements such as spikes, shock front, ball of fire, cloud, or skirt. The information used in this graph was extracted from multiple cameras pointed at ground zero, which collectively captured more than 100,000 frames in a matter of seconds. Yet even this staggering number of records was only a drop in the ocean of other instruments, devices, apparatus, and gadgets. Listed in another Los Alamos report, those instruments included spectrographs, seismographs, radars, ionization chambers, Geiger counters, geophones, barograph, diaphragms, foils, and a myriad of other sensors. Surrounding ground zero from all sides, those instruments provided a trove of experimental data for scientific analysis, practically turning the entire landscape into a large-scale laboratory. While this unprecedented documentation effort has indeed delivered a vast amount of valuable information, it simultaneously revealed the extent to which even the most sophisticated tools of scientific observation could not fully record and describe the complexity of a nuclear explosion. The scale, velocity, and intensity of the event have left even the most well-equipped observers in partial darkness. Cognitive and technical blindness continued to haunt the observation of nuclear tests in the years following Trinity. On April 26, 1954, Francis Harlow, a young scientist who was just recently hired at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, witnessed a hydrogen bomb explode in the Pacific Ocean. Harlow's recollection of the event, the 6.9 megaton Union shot at the Bikini Atoll, echoed the sentiments and language previously expressed by his Los Alamos colleagues. Quote, "It is difficult to find words for how awesome the experience was. The explosion we saw transformed a peaceful island to a raging column of infinite complexity," unquote. Harlow further noted that, quote, "The whole experience had a tremendous effect on my emotions," unquote, alluding to the psychological impact of the bomb, attested to also by many other witnesses. But there was something else that occupied Harlow in the immediate aftermath of the test. He later recalled that as he sailed back to the base, he had seen, quote, "so much of the experimental and engineering facilities and the equipment for processing the data that the observational instruments had recorded. Those data were the challenges that our computer codes had to be able to describe," unquote. Now, the computer codes that Harlow referred to here were the ones that he and his colleagues have been developing at Theoretical Division 3 of Los Alamos. This research group, colloquially known as Group T3, was pioneering the use of electronic computers to simulate the complex hydrodynamic behavior involved in the ignition and detonation of nuclear weapons. As Peter Gallison noted, the very invention of computer simulation was inherently linked to the development of nuclear weapons in Los Alamos. Indeed, the first round of calculations performed on the ENIAC, seen here, arguably the first fully digital computer, were done in December 1945 by a team of Los Alamos scientists who were testing the design concept for the hydrogen bomb. On a digital machine, phenomenon too complex for theory and too violent for empirical testing could be brought to life, so to speak, and analyzed. Now, one of the most significant challenges of nuclear weapon design was the prediction of the hydrodynamic behavior of matter inside the bomb, which, as you can imagine, instantly vaporized under the intense heat and pressure of the explosion. It is governed by nonlinearity and entropy, and this phenomenon proved extremely difficult to calculate. So while the principles for mathematical description of fluid dynamics were already established in the 19th and early 20th century, their application to this particular scenario were impossibly time-consuming. This is why once digital computers began to emerge, mathematicians such as John von Neumann or Stanislav Ulam immediately recognized their potential to effectively and accurately predict hydrodynamic behavior. From their earliest incarnation, numerical fluid simulations were often mediated as images. Yet their mimetic process relied on pure mathematical formulation, setting them apart from the epistemic models that undergird techniques such as drawings, photography, radiography, or sonography. Severed from direct sensorial perception of the world, computer simulations conjured realistic images of hidden forces based on blind calculation, a process of prediction in which sampling and probability play a cardinal role. In 1952, shortly after the von Neumann designed MANIAC computer became operational in Los Alamos, Stanislav Ulam and fellow physicist John Pasta used it to simulate the mixing of two fluids, seen here. By describing or treating the fluids as a field of discrete particles that exert calculable forces on each other, Ulam and Pasta's experiment delivered not only a probable forecast of the mixing pattern, but also created what are arguably some of the earliest computer-generated images. Building on this work, Group T3 of Los Alamos developed new and improved models for numerical fluid simulations, eventually laying down the foundations for what is now known as computational fluid dynamics, or CFD. Francis Harlow was appointed head of Group T3 in 1959, 5 years after his experience at the Bikini Atoll. Under Harlow's leadership, numerical fluid simulations became increasingly realistic and nuanced. The intricate motion of fluids and gases, the subtleties of their contortions, ebbs, and eddies were plotted as images by early electromechanical printers. Despite, or perhaps thanks to, being completely detached from physical reality, the form of mimesis practiced by Group T3 managed not only to gaze deeper into the hidden crevices of nature, but also, as we shall see, observe what is inherently blinding. A technical report from 1962, bearing the benign-sounding title, "Rise to the Atmosphere of a Hot Bubble," discusses a simulation of a high-altitude nuclear explosion. The date of the simulation and the list of associated advisors suggest that it was done in the context of Operation Fishbowl, a series of high-altitude nuclear tests conducted by the United States above the Pacific Ocean in the summer and fall of that year. It was during those tests that the effects of electromagnetic pulses, or EMP, was discovered, a phenomenon that damages sensitive electronic devices while also producing mesmerizing auroras in the higher atmosphere. Those intense visual effects captured here by photographs induced the same awe and astonishment we have encountered before. A faraway observer of the test wrote, quote, "I saw a flash of light. Then I saw a narrow band of blue light following the line of the Earth's magnetic field that eventually dipped down below the equator. I stood in awe. These were surely one of the most amazing things I've ever seen or will ever see. To this day, I don't understand why I did not have all our photographic equipment pointed at those lights," unquote. So entangled here again are the awesome and the ineffable, mixed with familiar frustration at the inability of technical observation to fully convey the magnitude of the event. Far less sublime, however, was the experience of dozens of test animals who were forced to watch the explosion on board of US Air Force airplanes from different altitudes and various distances. Strapped inside specially built cages, rabbits and monkeys directly faced the flash of the explosion. Back on the ground, scientists documented their retinal burns, aiming to develop protection gear for future nuclear warfare. A report describing the animals' eyes injuries serves as a sad testimony to the blinding power of the bomb and to the violence embedded in it. Read together, the two reports of the high-altitude test speak to the entanglement of the sublime and the traumatic in the observation of the bomb, and more generally, to blindness as a fundamental condition of knowledge as it pertains to nuclear weapons. Group T3 simulation, seen here, suggests an alternative epistemic framework. A series of images calculated on an IBM computer, spaced a fraction of a second apart, describe the rise of the immense hot bubble as it reaches a diameter of almost 50 kilometers in less than 3 seconds. The computer simulation depicts the invisible movement of air around the explosion, conveying the nuanced form assumed by the shockwave as it travels in hypersonic speed. Representing an event that never really occurred, yet nevertheless existed, or as Peter Gallison puts it, an event that was, quote, nowhere and everywhere, unquote, this sequence of images realistically describes what is brighter and hotter than the sun. What sets these images even further apart from sensorial observation is the fact that they are cross-sections of the explosions, slicing it through the center and providing a view from the inside, as it were. The use of this well-established representational convention was a technical constraint more than an aesthetic choice, attributed to the fact that available computing power at this period did not yet allow for three-dimensional calculations. Nevertheless, the use of the cross-section does position these images on a long historical lineage of an architectural and scientific convention that facilitates acts of measurement and categorization. The cross-section of the explosion is just one example of a large variety of cross-sections that were produced by Group T3 in that period. High-speed collisions of materials hitting each other in supersonic speeds was a recurring subject of simulation. Tested in different configurations, solids moving in high speed could be observed diffusing into each other upon impact. Some of the simulations were visualized as short film animations, and I have a lot of these. They're mesmerizing, but I just chose to show one. And this really they added a temporal dimension to the visual experience. Now, simulations of slower and cooler fluids motion soon followed, depicting scenarios such as water drop dripping into a shallow pool, air currents passing by a solid obstacle, producing waves and turbulence. These novel experiments were quickly recognized as applicable for civilian applications. In 1965, the Atom, a Los Alamos journal, reported that recent publications of Group T3 attracted a great deal of attention from various research communities who were interested in simulating different flow scenarios. And indeed, by the mid-1960s, Harlow and his team began applying their fluid simulations to field beyond nuclear research. Collaborating with different laboratories and government agencies, they simulated scenarios such as tidal waves, dam breaks, forest fires, and later, when 3D calculations became possible, also tornado formations and or air pollution in street canyons, to name just a few examples. Now, while exploring diverse and different subject matters, the simulations are governed by a single visual protagonist, the particle. The particle serves both as the discrete mathematical entity for the calculation process and simultaneously as a pictorial element which constructs the image through mass accumulation. Group T3 particle-based images mark a particular rupture in the history of spatial representation. They define space and matter in probabilistic terms that no longer work under the certitude of geometrical delineation. The absence of hard edges and lines from Group T3 imagery is not a stylistic choice, but a direct reflection of an epistemic system that represents the world through statistical sampling of small, discrete elements. Martin Heidegger has argued that, quote, the fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as a picture, unquote. In his view, the construction of images has furnished humans with what he described as, quote, an unlimited power for the calculating, planning, and molding of all things, unquote. As we shall see, the world that Francis Harlow and his team in Los Alamos attempted to conquer by blindly generated images was indeed all-encompassing. During the 1970s, while continuing his work on advanced hydrodynamic problems, Harlow began exploring what he later dubbed as spin-offs to computational fluid dynamics. In a series of what he admittedly called far-out theoretical experiments, he attempted to extend the scope of computer simulations beyond the realm of the physical. In a 1979 paper titled Mental Dynamics, Harlow proposes a framework for simulating and predicting the, quote, non-physical life activity within an organism, unquote. Applying the means and methods of numerical fluid simulations to non-physical processes was, in Harlow's view, a logical extension. Quote, as with the dynamics of molecules in a box or turbulent eddies in a river, the investigation of all details is considered from the outset to be impossible. Just as the principle of those complex processes nevertheless have been given precise formulations, so also the present goal is to write precise formulation for the principles of mental dynamics, unquote. In other words, Harlow envisioned simulating psychological and social patterns by essentially conceiving and treating them as fluids. Those simulations could be applied to the individual and to the collective, to the human and to the non-human alike. Quote, the theory should be applicable to the study of human mobs, schools of fish, packs of dogs, and other animal aggregates. It would also apply to the study of cultural units, villages, neighborhoods, industrial organizations, and larger political units, and to the long-range evolution of biological populations. In later experiments, he continued this line of exploration. The paper, Two Groups in Adversarial Encounter, described the pattern and possible outcomes of a hostile interaction by modeling, quote, such psychological properties as fear, excitement, peer pressure, moral outrage, and anger, end quote. These simulations were envisioned to depict platoons in battle, a SWAT team against rioting prisoners, opposing mobs of different ethnic backgrounds, and behavior of social and political units in the response to legislative and judicial activities, end quote. The total transferability of modeling fluid motions and human psyche, sociology, and biology is central to Harlow's machines cosmology. It establishes a conceptual foundation for turning the erratic and nonlinear patterns that govern every aspect and scale of living processes into a picture that is legible, predictable, and by extension, controllable. A harbinger of contemporary mental and social engineering practices, the simulation of notions such as fear, empathy, or excitement are, in my view, a direct extension of the radical discretization project that began in Los Alamos at the outset of the nuclear era. The awe, fear, and astonishment induced by the sight of the bomb could now be quantified, measured, and predicted by the very same machines that made the bomb possible. In his last published article, 3 years before his death in 2016, Harlow speculated on extending the scope of numerical simulation into the furthest reaches, biological evolution and the birth of the universe. Visualized here is a cross-section, much reminiscent of Group T3 early work, of the entire universe as it emerges from as a hot bubble from an enormous horizontal black hole. Visually evoking his experience nearly 60 years earlier as he watched the hydrogen bomb piercing the horizon of the Pacific Ocean, Harlow's last cross-section culminates a lifetime of experimentation which extended the notion of matter and observation beyond the realms of the physical, turning the unrepresentable into images conjured by blind machines of divination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uri, for this inspiring presentation. This was the last presentation, so I would like to ask all the presenters to come back to the stage so we can start the discussion. And I will ask also to Per-John or Vendetta to give a comment to this presentation, just to start the discussion maybe. So if you want to say something, so maybe.
All right. Oh, wow, that's loud. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to listen to your presentations after reading your papers, and I think they have, in a wonderful way, responded to the topic about architecture in an era rapidly dissolving boundaries between human and machine. I also believe that the 5 presentations elaborate on the role or the potentials of architecture in a techno-oriented world. When I read the call, I was really was fascinated by the quote of John von Neumann. Now I'm quoting it from the call. The exponential progress of technology has so far revealed no fundamental singularity in the history of humanity beyond which their affections will vanish. But scientists continue to march patiently towards that goal. I found that quote really interesting. And to me, this sets a tone for the uncritical faith in scientific process that we are living today. And I think it demonstrates an importance or a role of constructivist research processes where negotiations and speculations can weigh more heavily than objective truths. But also, I think also the importance of environments feasible to balance between positivist and constructivist traditions, and something that I think architecture always has been good in doing. So it's been a great read. It was a privilege to expand my understanding through your presentations and the images, which really added, I think, to my understanding of your scholarship. Just briefly, I think a common ground, how I read a common ground of this, it may be debated, but I think what connects these papers is the urge of drawing on a historiography of research and events in architecture and science to think around and conceptualize technological advancements that have impact on the contemporary. And then, of course, with a strong focus on the emergence of AI as an opportunity and a threat to multiple constituencies in architecture discipline, like authorship, design, process, and representation. I think, today I think we all ask ourselves, what will AI mean for architecture, discipline, and for profession? We do see anxieties all over, also prospects, and I think it's very important with occasions to think around and debate about this. So I'm very grateful to be here today, having that opportunity. Also, all presentations except for one explore mainly the 1950s to 70s, which I found very interesting. It's an era when the concept of cybernetics really took off, when multiple intersections between art and technology were activated and explored. I'm thinking about the EIT by Billy Kluver, for example, who used Rauschenberg and John Cage and a number of interesting people in the 60s into the 70s, kicked off the Pepsi Pavilion in Osaka in the 1970s. Nicolas Negroponte's Architecture Machine Group at MIT, the Art and Technology program at LACMA. Here in Europe, we have the Cybernetic Serendipity in London in '68. So it's a very dynamic and I think important historical context to be looking at. Then we have one presentation, one and a half, I say perhaps, that starts its dynamic period in more kind of focused on the 90s and late 90s. And this is also an interesting era. It was before the technical constraints of roaming the internet were kind of kicked in. Someone of you mentioned Lev Manovich, I think it was you, right? He's a very important scholar in this kind of context. Also a reminder of Lawrence Lessig, who is a very important scholar in writing about the code and the regulation of the code and how that kind of regulates the internet. So we are here in a very, very, I think, important historical kind of period, exploring, trying to find theoretical foundations for what we are living today. And thus perhaps the kind of the interest we see in the group here and the necessity to revisit this period, to extract the founding principles of the computer systems, the algorithms and the machines that transform the world today, principles that certainly have morphed and evolved throughout the decades, but uncovering those histories may assist in formulating critical architectures for tomorrow. And to me, that's really, the essence, the urgency that I'm very interested in thinking about. So that's my kind of common ground. Do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. So I would like just to share a brief reflection emerging from this highly fruitful morning of exchanges and perspective. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers, and also the organizer of the conference. I think that we have been used, you mean about to think about architecture as the production of a form or the construction of something that is symbolic, something that the architect, inscribes authorship into space and reality. I think that the question that emerged from all your presentation, I think, is whether buildings, and especially buildings for science or for industrial, for directive issues, can still be conceived in this way at all. This kind of buildings evolve very quickly, sometimes too quickly, and absorb a lot of technological mutation, depend on many systems that not remain fixed to architectural composition. So the buildings can be and can behave as adaptive machines. In this sense, much of the radical architecture dated starting from the 60s and the 70s, authors that you presented in your speeches, anticipated our present condition. with an extraordinary lucidity. And as, for instance, Antonio Azzolini observed, those experimental practices already understood with, I think 50 or 60 years ago, more or less, that architecture was shifting away from monument to infrastructure, from authorship towards technology and system. And so I would like to share with you this question that for me is central, is crucial in this morning. What remains of the author when the architectural work is designed to function without him? I mean, I think this is one of the most important questions we have to face nowadays.
I could go first since I'm very not interested in the author, and I really am interested in what happens when this field condition is utterly amplified, when the system takes over. What happens when you not only design a prefabricated system, but a computer system that can be overimposed over all Europe, and you can interchange both components and building elements, and the author entirely disappears. I think for me, the interest actually lies in what happens when there is no author and no architect, and the architect is designing this giant system. But still, I think everybody was designed, and all designers of the system were still educated within certain environments that have shaped the way they designed the systems. So in a way, the author is dead, but also quite not. So I'm more interested in the complete obfuscation of the role of the author, I think, in my research.
Just to follow up with that, in my view, the author becomes just marginal. I think there's a thread that maybe connects almost all of these talks. There's a concept of discretization, meaning that we have systems that can conceive the world as long as they are conceived as discrete small elements, and then that discretization should be accumulated. And then this is why computers are so good at it, because they have the ability to accumulate all these particles. And with the tabular, with the cybernetics, with Cedric Rice's little like physical cells. I mean, this is, for me, it's a red thread. And I'm glad that you mentioned John von Neumann, because I think he's very, very important to the discussion with his invention, also Stanislav Ulam, of the cellular automata, which was really like the predecessor of a lot of these systems. And also worked, of course, with cells. So we're dealing with a cellular space of many, many, many different authors, and non-authors also, and non-humans. And so, again, these are just like, it's a system of discretization and accumulation that works with these things.
I have a more cynical answer to that. I'm also in a camp of no author. I think one could see the answer to your question, what happens to the author when it's kind of like, omitted from the technological stack. Arguably, one could look at most architecture, even name architecture built in the last few decades, and see how does that look like. Because I think, as we also saw yesterday, there was presentation about patents. That there's this whole idea of proprietary building systems that is just another layer of the technological systems that all have kind of, the author is dead and the corpse is cannibalized by all those other kind of like hyper-specialized expertises. And I think most buildings, especially larger buildings, the kind of like public scale corporate buildings, I think you can see how it looks like. You have a floor-to-ceiling height 240. And everything is made of modular systems that are probably perfectly compatible with kind of inventories and catalogs and patents and IP and all these kind of data structures. So I think the question of authorship has already been kind of like dissolved for quite some time, and it's not just the technology that has done it. It's part of this bigger kind of techno-managerial stack that building industry has become.
So from my point of view is kind of opposite actually, because from my point of view is authorship, what remains to authorship today is everything remains to authorship actually. I mean, it's provocative, but is it's gone. Okay. So because I think that authorship and my presentation about Cedric Price tend to say that if we think about contemporary practice today, there is, for example, in Toulouse, BAST, which is a Bureau d'Architecture sans titre. It does exist a publication OESA about authorship, where there is a collective that is anonymous. And there is, of course, authorship has become more into the collective dimension of the collective that produce architecture today. So what I think is that is actually a choice. I mean, anonymity is a choice. And I think and actually is about declaring an identity of what do you want to be, facing the profession, facing the discipline, and facing whatever. So I think, for instance, of a phrase from Aldo Rossi, which is very an author actually, and he say that, for instance, the identity is actually choosing, and so what remains to architecture in digital AI environment today is to choose what to follow or not to follow. Like, for instance, AI is a tool. It came from something. We see it right now as an oracle, as an ancient Greek, but actually is a tool. It is an instrument that we can choose to use or not use. And if we use it, we can choose how to use it. I mean, it's a lot of level that are inside. I think the real problem today, or not problem, the real question probably could be not what remains of the author, that from my point of view is everything, but what remains of materiality, which is, it seems that Matthias was talking about Envers exploration during the 90s, which is the digital turn, but actually all those experimentations were made to explore the physical reality. It was like an automata, actually in English it's called. So it has something that it was trying to the real essence of physicality, of physical environment. Today, maybe the real question is what's happening if we left about the physicality. So because AI is very connected to the season of automata of 17th century or 18th centuries, and those periods where actually there is the difference that those periods where the physicality, I mean how to say, sorry in English, I mean the magnificence was about the existence of those objects, those fantastic objects. Today we are fascinated by something that doesn't exist, so that's
So I agree with Antonio, and for me the question is also what's remain of the author, but also what in the future will remain of data. So for me is a responsibility of architecture and intellectuals and humans to find our place in the world, and don't use what outcome from out, but we need to make decision and make choice to how use instrument and technologies, because obviously we can't stop that. But I think that the initial fascinating of each kind of technologies maybe can bring us to take many distance of our responsibility. So that's all.
Thank you. I'd like to move or think about authorship in relationship. We move from that topic into the disciplines that we are kind of covering here. I mean, authorship. I was thinking about this question very much when I saw Maya, your images, your diagrams, beautiful diagrams, where the word planning was all over the place. I didn't see design. I saw design process in one of these diagrams, but the term planning was all over. And I was thinking, I mean, here we have, perhaps we are looking into disciplinary differences here. I mean, urban planning is a different discipline from architecture. We learned that from Francis Choi, Aurelius writing, etc., etc. Working through working through cities, buildings, and representation through design and through planning, maybe or is different. And I'm kind of curious about where you think design versus planning unfolds in your scholarship as two different processes. I mean, you talk specifically about the fascination about urbanization in the late 1900s. And I was thinking, is this really a way to understand urbanization, a fascination for that, which may or may not, rely directly to architecture? And we also seen the one form that has emerged throughout most of the presentations, not yours, I think, Monica. Little less in the last one, but still, you had the grid there. The grid is kind of pervasive here among all the presenters, using the grid as the form of kind of organizing either data, information, space, whatever. So again, I mean, design, planning, architecture, urbanism. Where do you find your scholarship?
Okay, I'll just give a quick answer. My particular case study looked at Dutch context today, and as we know, Netherlands is one of the kind of most dense and kind of hyper-planned kind of territory in European context. So that kind of obsession with planning on all scales, has been kind of quite characteristic. And in fact, I looked at MEIDV, but you can find also earlier project by OMA that tried to make some similar exercise of like concentrating the whole, 15 million, whatever it was, the population in 90s of the Netherlands into like one kind of like small part of the whole country, and then to test this idea of capacity. So planning, I think in Netherlands, in Dutch context, is very much a question of capacity. But of course, I think there are other ways to look at it in other contexts.
Yeah, the question of the grid is interesting. It reminds me of a Ziegert take on the grids, that there are certain types of grids. One is the grid that is a little bit like the ceiling above us, where you have a grid and then you can add objects to the grid. So it can create a system where objects could be added to the grid. Then there's another type of grid which ties to empire and colonialism, which is the grid that allows for expansion. But I would say that maybe what's emerging is a different type of grid which allows for prediction, which is for me there's another, and it's true. Like it's really that it's the cellular automata, it's the cellular space that allows for flow to go through it, and it's also a question of the reality we live in, which is really a reality of high velocity, of speed, of flows, and nothing else. And then the grid really allows us to not necessarily, control also, but also to predict what these flows could become. So the grid, I think, is essential, and this is why I think it's relevant both to architecture, to details, to any scale of design, basically.
Thank you. I think it was a great observation about planning and design, but I also think about it in terms of far less in terms of urban planning, but I think planning as a social concept that really emerges in the interwar period. And then I think everything in Europe, especially Northern Europe, is heavily affected during the Second World War, because everything that was happening during the military action involves substantial amounts of planning, of resources, of action, of mobilization, of industries. So I think in the post-war period, you really see this grand scale planning, not in terms of, once again, urban planning, but planning of processes really seeping into everyday life and other conditions. And then also the growth of the state, as I mentioned, and you could see it in the interwar period, but in the post-war period, the growing importance of the state that administered all investments, the growth of the welfare state that required this type of planning, the grant schemes, the grant calculations, the grids, where you could insert different variables and then distribute according to that. I think it also translates to, once again, all spheres of life, including architecture. And I think particularly in the Northern European context, it ceases to become this kind of in-shop artisanal practice in architecture, but instead becomes planning of different processes. And I think planning and process is very much connected. And again, it's really not specific to urban planning. I think architecture becomes an algorithmic, systemic practice where different resources have to be allocated to different kind of variables within an equation. So this desire for kind of processualization of architecture, I think this is what this presentation, my presentation was a little bit about. And I think planning is a very interesting concept. I will have to think a bit more about that.
So actually I don't know how to answer, but what I think is that of course it's actually a problem of scale, of course, planning, because you can plan into little scale or big scale. But what change, even in Cedric Price architecture, I don't know if it seems that Cedric Price seems as a planner actually, but I think that I saw him as a more romantic architect, which is very strange from, could be strange to suppose, because when he was not thinking of planning, I'm talking about him, but it's the difference of planning in different scale, because he was not thinking of data as a dimensional output, like for instance is we need those, we have those people, we need those beds, we need those things in dimensional. He was thinking about in a desire effect condition. So it's a very romantic planning way of doing, because for instance, it's the generator, the planning, I mean, of course, except the boredom program, which randomize everything, was actually, it was called as a recipe, sorry. It was like a recipe made from the desire of all of them, and so it's like a big dish cooked by the system. So in that kind of way, I mean, this is probably the difference that we have to mention. If we're taking planning as a measurement, or if we're taking planning as an aim of our effort in architecture or landscaping or whatever, or urban planning.
Now, I was thinking, listening to Antonio, that since Gali wasn't an architect, so he didn't any kind of project, but the interest in for me is the approach, so the use of art to understand the change in time, and I was thinking on that Cedric Price was anticipator, an inventor, but he used plan section and drawings. So he's a different kind of architect from now, because now we just use data, a big number of data, and maybe we can build a city without any plans, without any section. That for me is strange. Maybe in the future it will be normal, but for me, we are in a changing time. For me, it's strange, because I can think that architecture can be without drawings. Maybe you can do drawings by computers, that is obviously, maybe AutoCAD, but the idea that you put numbers and you have a building, maybe the form and the architect and the author of the form is at the end of the process, and you have to talk with engineer for the structure and implants and all the things, maybe the green. At the end, there is architect. For me is already strange.
I just want to maybe respond to that. I think we should be careful with this with the idea of this will replace that. This will kill that. This kind of a Victor Hugo of like we have. I think authorship and drawings still exist. They will exist. But the way they are organized, distributed, and managed, and their agency will be quite different. So yeah, I think we need to kind of accept that it's not like we have AI and that's going to replace everything. It's just going to organize things differently, which in a very radical way. But it's for me, it's a question of organization, less than like one system replacing another.
Yeah, and maybe also to just add to that, I think we need to be careful thinking that the systems are anonymous, and they're not anonymous. There are plenty of people, concrete people behind them, plenty of decision makers, plenty of people making very black and white decisions of what is going to be shown to you on the screen and not, and at what point and when. And AI is anything but an autonomous and anonymous tool. It's made by so many decisions of so many people, that exactly, very political decisions too, that in the end, I think it's also really important to remember that while it looks like a black box, it's really not a black box, it's a black box full of people inside.
I just also want to add very quickly, because I think we kind of mentioned Cedric Price, and I don't know if Antonio agrees with me or not, but I think your presentation revealed that quite beautifully, that in a way he was a planner of time, right? And obsolescence, he's been written a lot about obsolescence, and as you pointed out, when the interaction center was set for demolition, he actually was kind of pro-demolition. And I think one of the most beautiful kind of media objects I've seen from his work, I think it was for the generator project. It's kind of like a table/timeline of expected lifespans of different building components, almost like charted out in some kind of 30 year period. So there was clearly like some kind of like idea that maybe he as an architect, through maybe different kind of media objects that are not floor plans, not drawings, but all these other kind of beautiful diagrams and charts he made, that he can plan things in across different dimensions in a way, which I think was quite fascinating. If that's
yes, giving also my point of view, and maybe it's quite extreme. I would like to be a little bit extreme. And as outlined also by Matis in his presentation, it seems that architectural and urban projects are no longer simply represented or designed at one time, but continuously recalculated. I mean, it's like the data sheet, the spreadsheet, may be more influential than the sketch. I mean, it's extreme as a perspective, but I think it's quite true. But one challenging issues in this perspective is that you have what if scenarios. So you can figure it out, and you can also balance the positive aspect and the criticism. So it's not too bad in this way. So in my view, it's a fact that architecture is becoming more and more absorbed into automated systems, AI, BIM, and so on. And this is very linked to data management, optimization issues, predictive control. These are all matters of time. For me, the risk is not the disappearance of the architect as an author. It's more the risk of disappearance of architecture as a critical practice. So it's the figure of Leonardo Sinisgalli that was outlined in your presentation is symbolic, because he refused the separation between humanistic culture and technological knowledge. This is a very Italian point of view. But, yes. But I think that we can catch something about this view, because in my view, the risk, I repeat, is the absence of a critical approach. Not the machine, not the AI, is the human being that is not capable of approach the architecture, but reality in a general way, in a critical way.
Yeah, well, I could I could add to that. I agree, and I was thinking a little bit. I mean, drawing on your comment, and perhaps throwing it back to you. I mean, the architect as a critical practice. I mean, the architect and the role of the author. I mean, I was thinking perhaps also back to you, Monica. I mean, when you when you talked about this guy. Sinigali. You described him as some kind of cultural figure that kind of mobilized intellectual and creative kind of incentives to explore the contemporary condition. And to me, that's, I mean, that may be a question to you. Is he an author or is he something else? It seems like he's a curator. Could it be something else? I mean, and I completely agree. I don't think we can kill anything. I mean, there's transformations going on. So what, I mean, drawing on your own research into these precedents, I mean, how do you see, if you envision the author, I mean, the transformation of the author, what would become the role of the architect and the critical kind of practice in those scenarios?
He was a particular figure in the 50s because he was an engineer and mathematician for formation, for studies, since he was younger. But he started to write poets when he was young, so today he's famous like a poet. But in his life, he worked in the major society of these years, like Finmeccanica, that was the head of each industry of that period in Italy, and also with Olivetti, Pirelli, and after also Alitalia. And in that society, he worked into the communicative office and for publicity. So he designed the publicity of all of this society. Marketing is the right word. And he founded not also Civiltà delle Macchine, that it was initially the company journal of Finmeccanica. For this, there was the linking with the industry and the site visit, because all the industry that artists visit was of Finmeccanica. And also in Pirelli, before of Civiltà delle Macchine, he founded another journal company that was the anticipator of Civiltà delle Macchine. But the importance is that this kind of journal, with his vision, became the example for the cultural journal of that period. So the linking between technical art and a big vision that going from one discipline to another was anticipated by Sinisgalli in this experience.
Actually, I forgotten the actual point. Okay. Well, actually, I don't know. I take some time. I left the other one.
Yeah, for me, the question of authorship is interesting. If you of course, now when you think about computers, you know, can a computer create something? And again, the question is ancient. You know, it's the myth of Pygmalion. I mean, it's things. It's the golem. So these are questions that it's the myth of creation. Can we create something that will create something else? Can we be replaced? I think the question is yes. Unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but I don't want to say, again, I don't want to frame it as like, okay, we're going to be replaced by machines. It's not the case. We're going to be we are currently being absorbed into that system, that machines are part of it and other things. But I think there's something quite also interesting and maybe hopeful in that, the fact that we maybe can think of knowledge not as not completely derived from our senses. You know, meaning that the way we perceive architecture traditionally, let's say, is like mainly through vision, a little bit of tactile, but then, you know, with these kind of systems, they don't have a smell. They don't look like anything. They have, you know, they're like, tables. But that's just a visualization. But I think what's interesting is to think about this type of knowledge that is much maybe closer to dreams, or to hallucinations, or LSD trips, where you see without seeing, or you sense without sensing. And there's some kind of an internal process, blind process, that these machines do that maybe we can learn from and kind of detach also from our senses. Not necessarily that machines will replace our senses, but maybe we can somehow sense the world differently, and then being different type of authors, I guess. Or maybe we're not going to be authors anymore, we're just going to be part of the world, as opposed to like authoring the world as authoritarian.
If I could just add, and maybe totally contradict what I said earlier about authorship, and I feel very comfortable about contradicting myself. But I think it's interesting. It's true, and like every kind of media that architects use also determines the way that they kind of see things, right? Like we don't build, we produce information about it, and depending on how we encode that information, we also kind of feel about it in a particular way. We know about it in a particular way. And that's why I think the kind of question of interface is kind of seemed to be very important to me to explore. Also because, not least because actually it comes from the kind of thermodynamics and this idea of the contact area between two different substances, and then what happens in that kind of contact area or the surface, right? And of course, if you kind of apply that thinking to the kind of human to computer or even computer to computer interaction, then of course different ways of designing and envisioning this interfaces also kind of makes architects or the authors to author in different ways. And as many presentations shown today, maybe there's this kind of like undertone or the trajectory of scientific management that has kind of like primarily determined the way that we construct our interfaces and the way we think about that. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way to do that in architecture, and that's not the only way how we could in principle interface with other systems.
Sorry, mine is just a very brief comment combining actually two of your points, because you were talking about how perhaps the financial ledger sheet, the Excel sheet, is more important than the drawing, or could be. But that's also because a lot of our, how we calculate the value of the building is based on certain variables we agreed are important, while I think is also important to remember that that's a social agreement, and we could choose to value other things and also input them in calculations. For example, the long-term lives of the buildings, so the satisfaction of the people or the experience of the people who live in them. We could assign different values to these terms and also begin to encode them. So in a way, it's kind of also related to what you were saying, that we are experiencing this blindness, and maybe the blindness can be, things can be made visible in different ways that we have not thought about in terms of building performance. Or now, for example, with the environmental performance of the buildings, we actually begin to encode it in some way, but that's probably just the top of the very large list of things.
About augmenting authorship and how machines work about that, I think that actually the word augmenting, enriching is actually inside the word of author itself, etymologically inside, because it came from Latin auctor, that came from auger, which means to enrich actually. What I was thinking is that we think a lot of time we think about machine as something that is capable of saving, changing all the, but we don't focus on what we can do with how we enrich, author, but is a very wide category for me. I think about, for instance, is of a story about that has two parallel story, which is the version of Mario Carpo telling about how where the CAD software came into the Gary's office. And of course, he say from engineering, air engineering, and etc. But there is also another version about the same story that is called from Beatrice Colomina in X-ray architecture. That actually is the same story that tell where those software came, and Gary tell oh, they came from biomed engineering. So it's not a problem about where the software came, how the software work, or software as a machine I'm talking about, or if Gary is lying in which condition. What is important is what with the tools is capable of doing and switching the reality, augmenting the reality, and making a very interesting turn that could be beautiful or awful, whatever. I mean, we can have position, but it's something about that. And so, and about the authorship as a category, I think that authorship is about something not only about the architect, but also what Cedric Price could teach us is about how is used the space, so everyone could be an authorship. And for instance, I think about Beck and Lemoine documentary about the use of the Maison Bordeaux from the Maid, which is another version of the reality that enrich. That's the kind of that's a kind of point of view from me about that.
Maybe just to give one practical example of what we were talking, especially like maybe what Maria was saying, and this is coming from again coming back to Denmark, because Denmark was so kind of, and Sweden a bit was kind of figuring. One of the recent developments in this so-called Great Transition is the kind of mandatory life cycle assessment that has to be done to all kind of major buildings in Denmark, and it's mandated. I know how it is in the rest of the EU, but because I'm in Danish context, that's why I know it better. And it's mandatory, so you must do it, and that means you need to invite other expertise, other authorship at some point to kind of decide that. But then to Maria's point, like the question is, how do you calculate the environmental effects of a building? And one of the kind of interesting discussions happening right now is this idea of consequential LCA, meaning that you kind of trace consequences down the kind of supply chains and ripple effects beyond the building or the kind of immediate environment, or maybe beyond the borders of the Danish state. But you know, because most materials are imported from somewhere else, a lot of waste is exported to somewhere else. So there's this question: how do you agree on the kind of framing of that? And again, this is totally a political and kind of like, you know, I mean, non-architectural question in that sense, but it totally comes back to architecture and how do you measure and evaluate and maybe ultimately define the parameters of what is permissible to be built.
Yes, I agree. Life cycle assessment is a very interesting approach in designing and in the whole design and construction process. The issues maybe is how to measure parameters, how to have, the KPI to detect if a building or an infrastructure is satisfy these requirements or not. Maybe I would like to know if someone of you would like to add something or ask something.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you, and congratulations. Really, really wonderful lineup of beautiful contributions, how they speak to each other. So I think I have a question about imaging, and I'm interested in seeing how images and pictures are playing different roles in your presentations. I mean, even Mathis, in your case, it seems like the data tabulation can do the work, and yet the pictorial side of it plays a part. And for Uri, I mean, your Heidegger quote stays with me, world picture, and that kind of to me quite a strangely anachronistic way to use data to almost model pretty much everything. There is some slightly strangely 19th century, I'm thinking of Etienne Joumaret and the graphic method, and there's a positivism there. And so I don't know if I have a question for everyone, or just maybe Matisse and Uri about what do you see there, like, whether for Uri, for example, do you see Harlow as a anomaly in this computational modeling of fluidity? I mean, there are so many other ways to do this, and yet I think your story is striking in how you construct a narrative from the bomb to fear to social activities. So do you see him as in line with the methods and its presence in a bigger epistemological trajectory, or there's something strange about him? And for Matisse, I'm interested in how you see what those images are doing there. Are they purely, let's say, simulational artifacts, or what work do they do? I mean, we understand they are architects, so somehow they had to produce something, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Taran. Harlow was a weird guy, and he was definitely not a positivist. I think he was a shaman in a disguise as a positivist. I mean, there's part of the research that I didn't present today, but he had a parallel career, Harlow. He was an expert in Pueblo ceramics, Pueblo pottery. He was a self-taught expert. He was also a painter, and he taught himself, really, he was an autodidact. He taught himself, and he published scholarly books about Pueblo pottery. And if you look at his drawings of the pottery, the same symbols of the same images of flows, of forces that we cannot see, that were very important to the Native Americans because of the rain and the weather that they were dependent on in the American Southwest. Those symbols emerged there, and it's funny because he, as far as whatever I read about him and by him, he never made the connection between these two parallel lives that he had, about the Native American scholar and the computational fluid dynamic scientist. And that's a piece I'm trying to put together, because I think he tapped there, and maybe by extension, this type of science that is blind is tapping into something that is perhaps pre-modern and pagan, that is about understanding and imaging forces that we don't see, that we sense, that we feel, but where we don't even sense, we dream. So for me, the images are really kind of dream images. What I hope to perhaps prove, let's say, is that he wasn't a positivist kind of progress-oriented, necessary progress-oriented research. There was a side to it. There was some kind of perhaps subconscious side to it that was very explicit. That was about something that is definitely non-modern.
Yeah, good. Thank you for the question. Actually, I should have asked someone else to ask that question, because so it's really great that you picked it up. So yeah, super. I think that question of images is actually super important, because that still remains the kind of one of the kind of most commonly circulating medium, maybe now more than ever because of unnamed technological developments of the last few years. But I think in context of my work, and if you think in the spreadsheet, it's very interesting, because of course one of the references that comes up is the question of operational images or technical images, and that's of course coming back to the military is Harun Faraki's work. I'm sure some of you have seen his beautiful video work about this idea that there are these images that are made by machines and for machines, and he uses the example of military technology. There was this one beautiful image of a simulation of a missile being shot over landscape, and the film shows what the missile sees, which is this kind of semi-abstract terrain, which is partially legible for humans, but actually it's not meant for humans. So basically, some part of his work is about trying to kind of demystify these kind of like, operational kind of images that kind of do things in a way. And of course, UC Parika has written about, he wrote this whole book about operational images, and one of the things he mentions is the spreadsheet, and for him it's this kind of like thing that is not, as he says, not particularly interesting to look at, but actually it is a very central thing that organizes most of kind of social and economical life at the same time. So maybe if we stretch that kind of like definition, beyond the kind of machine-to-machine interaction, then of course I think there is this kind of idea that things like spreadsheet are images that do things in a way. They are meant to kind of like perform in a particular way that is not fully legible and not fully visual. In other words, I think these are images that have some kind of depth that goes beyond the interface, right? So interface is what was being rendered on a screen through computational processes, through graphic rendering, but behind that there's another kind of thing happening in that image. And that means that the image is always changing. You could open it any time and it looks different. To give you one of the examples, I try to, and this is one of the difficult things to study these things. I have to work with born digital materials in archives. If I go to an archive to look at building spreadsheet, quite often I just see like a very big printout on paper. I think that's for a good reason, that once you print out a spreadsheet, once you print out some kind of operational image into two-dimensional surface, it becomes kind of fixed. No longer somebody can change one number and then it will look differently. No longer needed to be rendered. It's kind of like becomes this kind of like paper technology in a way at that point. So I think it is something about this kind of, all these current discussion about different images. I think Trevor Paglen recently wrote this fantastic piece, The Images Are Looking at You, where he kind of tries to kind of unpack this kind of like question of operational or technical images that kind of like have much more than just what you see on a surface, and the way that they perform is not purely visual or symbolic.
Briefly add also in terms of systems thinking, the representation of the systems is very complicated. How to draw a diagram of an architectural process, or in general how the building is made, how to capture it in a diagram, which these people struggled with. But then also the image that I opened and closed with, this superimposed Vitruvian man over a perforated punch card system with some kind of modular diagram behind it. I find it very interesting how the architects who were eventually behind the systems, who were authors behind the systems, tried to make sense of this very abstract notation and computerized, spreadsheets by bringing it back to some references from their professional and educational life, always referring to Modular and Da Vinci and, some kind of magic code of the universe. But I really find this kind of arbitrariness of descriptions in this way and the metaphysical claim associated with that very interesting. It's like superimposed ultimate rationality with this imagery of metaphysical universality, because nothing in the end, no science is scientific. Sorry, but yeah.
Just to say something to conclude, but I don't want to conclude this day, and actually I want to open the discussion, and I would be really, glad to have an open discussion with you, because all this topic can enrich us. So I just want to say that we are in the right place, because I just realized that this space, it's something related to the concept of weird, because we have all the ingredients. We have a balcony coming from an obelisk, we have a mirror and also a curtain. Yes, of course it's not red, it's pink, so it's not like David Lynch movies, but I think that we have all the ingredients. And actually, by no coincidence, I mean, we started from the desert, with Bill keynote speech, and we concluded with desert. And maybe it's a kind of different architecture because we move from a very iconic architecture, a very iconic vision of architecture to something related, I don't know, to the air and to the uncommunicability. So it's a very large array of topics. So starting from what Bill said in the opening, I was just thinking about some very informal notes like Rainer Banham going through the desert and framing some architecture. He declared to be an observational historian, so he need to see architecture, visit architecture from the inside. And he basically has also all the instrument, all the tools to understand architecture very well. He was well trained, of course. He studied with Nikolaus Pevsner, but yeah, he has all the elements to make distinction, make selection. So he was very great in understanding what's a good architect and what is not. Of course, today we have a kind of much more blurring vision of things, and also this concept of authorship is something that we can reconceptualize many times. Also what you said, the author or the curator. The author considered like an authoritarian people. I think that it's very strong kind of separation. I think that we have to open discussion and maybe avoid to crystallize the idea of authorship, because there is many things that can change. I think that we need to find common ground. Yes, many of your papers were so basically they look this vision of architecture like a corpus, like a body, like something that incorporated, encapsulated meaning, but also media, all the apparatus of the many apparatus. But in other cases, architecture was intended as something like. What's the way? As something emerging by chance. So something used like a medium or something that disappears at all. So what I'm thinking is how we can develop all this path and how we can create common grounds, and maybe probably we have to move to maybe distinct some subtopics or some different kind of categories, because these three categories probably are not the best option, the nature, the machine. So I think that now we have to start a very interesting process of creating common grounds and also creating some very subtle path between your of course, you made a lot of micro-histories, if I can quote Carlo Ginzburg, the Italian writer who wrote for Maggio I Vermi, I don't know what's the translation, cheese and worms, like something like that. So now it's very interesting, and it's very difficult probably to try to see this subtle path between your work, but I really thank you very much for all this brilliant work, I have to say, and thank you, Bill.